The 90s was a hugely transformational time for the WWF. Yes, from the decade starting off at the tail end of Hulkamania, moving on into a time of more athletic performers like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, and finally onto the Attitude Era. It's a time that will never be forgotten. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire decade year by year in the WWF in the 90s, a decade in review. The year 1990 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of film, we were first introduced to the likes of Home Alone and Goodfellas. In television, we saw the early episodes of Seinfeld. Meanwhile, in the WWF, Hulkamania was still running wild, and a new challenger emerged as the decade began. However, in many ways, it was a strange year for the promotion. Yes, it was supposed to be a traditional year, the passing of the torch from one top star to the next right as the company was moving away from the 80s and into the 90s. Of course, as much as things change though, they always stay the same. And come December, it looked very much like we were heading back towards the old status quo again. But that's not to say there weren't some big moments during the first year of the 90s, with one particularly game-changing debut being saved right for its tail end. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the promotion's first year of the new decade in the WWF in 1990, a year in review. The 1980s had been a strong period for Vince McMahon. He'd been able to successfully take pro wrestling worldwide with the advent of the Hulkamania era, combining his top star Hulk Hogan with a roster of excellent supporting characters such as Rowdy Roddy Piper, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Andre the Giant, then helping to push them over the top by bringing in mainstream names such as Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper so as to further grab the public's attention. Hell, in 1989, the company had arguably reached their creative peak when they had the Mega Powers explode, with this being the culmination of a year-long story that saw the top two babyfaces, the Hulkster and Savage, come to blows at WrestleMania 5. That said, as the new decade was dawning, McMahon, always looking for the next big thing, had begun the search for someone to replace his biggest star going forward, partially because he felt that, with Hogan now having been on top for 5 years, it was time to freshen things up, and partially because, as the champ was beginning to start a movie career, the boss was fearful that he might be left high and dry if he didn't plan ahead. Luckily then, a new star had already been blossoming for the past year or so, one that would already be familiar to fans as the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, with his high-energy entrance and comic book character come-to-life look, Vince was quick to see dollar signs everywhere the rising star went, and that was why, somewhere around the turn of the year, he made the decision to start moving the Warrior into the position to be his next top draw. And where better to coronate him than at the showcase of the Immortals itself? The only problem with this, however, was that Hogan was still the champion at that time, and WWF had never been so bold as to try to have two top babyfaces face off against each other for fear that it might leave the crowd unsure of who to cheer for. Sure, they'd done the Mega Powers blow-off the year prior, but before that bout, the Macho Man had very clearly turned heel, leaving audiences with little doubt as to who was the good guy. Still, feeling he needed to try something new, the boss felt like now was the time to try what he never had before, asking fans to make the choice as to who they would be siding with at WrestleMania 6. Before that would come though, they would have to start setting things up at the January 21st Royal Rumble where, in the middle of the titular match, the two most popular stars in the WWF would come face to face for the first time, having a brief stare-off before the Warrior was eliminated with the unintentional help of the champion. More important than who was eliminated though was the reaction of the fans as, realizing what was being teased here, they exploded with approval, with this being enough to convince McMahon that he had made the right decision, and as such should push forth with the big babyface versus babyface match. But that wasn't the only notable thing that happened on the night as, in the very same match, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase would set the record for length of time in the Rumble when he entered at number 1 and survived for a full 44 minutes and 47 seconds. As well as this, Mr. Perfect would put on an impressive showing himself, coming very close to winning the whole thing before he was thrown over the top rope by the Hulkster in the end. Behind the scenes, however, this was seen as a somewhat controversial decision, as Hennig had originally been planned to win the whole thing, with Hogan using his backstage power to get things changed at the last minute. Yes, even back then, the champion was using all his sway to call the shots whenever he wanted to. At the time though, with the internet being non-existent and dirt sheets only being read by a very small minority, most fans had no idea about this. All they saw instead was the all-conquering hero coming out on top, and so they cheered this accordingly as it happened. And well, with these positive reactions, the boss must have come out of the Royal Rumble that year feeling like the whole thing had been a blow-away success. That's not to say it didn't have its downsides too, as, like many WWF pay-per-views at the time, the undercard was left severely lacking, with matches like Brutus the Barber Beefcake versus The Genius and Ronnie Garvin versus Greg the Hammer Valentine being forced to fill out the show. And before the company reached the heights of WrestleMania 6, there would be another blow as, feeling like there was no more appetite for women's wrestling in his company anymore, Vince McMahon formally deactivated the women's title on February 21st, with this making Rockin' Robin the last official champion up until the point the belt would be revived in September of 1998 and won by Jacqueline. Still, even if the girls were disappointed, this didn't give fans much pause for thought at the time, as their main focus was already on the upcoming showdown between the Unstoppable Force and the Immovable Object at the biggest show of the year. That said, that wouldn't be the only thing making WrestleMania 6 worth watching, as, on the same card, fans would get to see the culmination of a year's worth of stories that included Andre the Giant having one of his final in-ring appearances, Dusty Rhodes teaming with Sapphire to take on Randy Savage and Sherry Martel, Roddy Piper characteristically courting controversy when he painted half his body black prior to his match with Bad News Brown, and Diamond Dallas Page getting to have a cameo appearance driving Rhythm and Blues down to the ring in his pink Cadillac. But those were all on the undercard, and it was the main event where the real story lay. Hogan versus Warrior for the title, winner take all. Of course, this main event may have never ended up happening if the Macho Man had gotten his way, however, as just a few weeks prior to the show, he'd gotten one more shot at the Hulkster during the February 23rd episode of the main event, a match that was originally supposed to see Mike Tyson appear in WWF 8 years early after he was booked to be the special guest referee. Plans for this changed though when, 2 weeks prior to this, Tyson would be knocked out by Buster Douglas in one of the biggest upsets in boxing history, with this ultimately being the reason that Douglas was brought in to officiate the match instead. But regardless of who the ref was, the result would end up the same. Hogan would retain his title and move on to WrestleMania where, in an expertly laid out bout that played to both men's limitations, stole the show and was later voted by readers of Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine to be their match of the year. And with many future WWF stars such as Edge, Christian, Lance Storm, and Renee Young all watching in attendance that night, the Ultimate Warrior would do the unthinkable by the end when he pinned Hogan clean in the middle of the ring to dethrone him as champion and start his own reign at the top. Yes, the torch had been passed, and so now, going forward, while the Hulkster left for a while to focus on his movie career and do some dates in Japan, Vince McMahon began pushing the Warrior as a top star for the 90s. Unfortunately, however, the first step in this push was to have him immediately vacate the Intercontinental title, as kayfabe WWF President Jack Tunney deemed him unable to defend both belts simultaneously. So while the new Intercontinental Champion was being decided in a tournament that eventually saw Mr. Perfect come out the winner, the World Champion entered into a feud with Ravishing Rick Rude that would see the two reunite their program from the year prior. Sadly though, this never got to feel like the main event program it should have been, as, by the time it was picking up steam, Hogan had returned to the company to start his own war with Earthquake. And with fans still having their old hero there to take the shine off the new one then, the Warrior felt very much like he was playing second fiddle to the real top star, as while he was taking on Rude in a steel cage match at August 27th SummerSlam, the Hulkster was taking on his larger-than-life foe in what many saw as the true main event. Before that would come though, WWF would have one of their most intriguing shows of that era when, as part of the working relationship with both New Japan and All Japan Pro Wrestling, they would take part in the WWF NJPW AJPW Wrestling Summit Show on April 13th in Tokyo, Japan, a show that would see the likes of Bret Hart take on Tiger Mask and Hulk Hogan face off against Stan Hansen. And while it was well received, eventually being voted the best show of the year by readers of Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter, it would still mark the only time that all three companies would ever co-promote a show together, with New Japan and All Japan's rivalry making any future attempts at this impossible. Once that was done though, it was back stateside, where WWF continued to build towards the upcoming SummerSlam pay-per-view. And in the lead up to this, fans would get to see some new faces added to the roster when, on July 16th, both the Road Warriors and Kerry Von Erich would make their debuts at a Wrestling Challenge taping, with them later to be renamed as the Legion of Doom and the Texas Tornado, respectively. And while that was going on, tragedy would strike for one Brutus Beefcake, as he would suffer a horrific injury when he was hit in the face by a parasailer that same month, with this requiring him to take the rest of the year off as he underwent facial reconstructive surgery. On a better note, however, when the night of SummerSlam finally came, fans were treated to another good show, as it was there that they would see both the Texas Tornado win the Intercontinental title from Mr. Perfect and the Hart Foundation win the WWF Tag Team titles from Demolition, all while, elsewhere, Hulk Hogan was toppling Earthquake and the Ultimate Warrior was defending his world title against Rick Rude. And as it happened, this would end up being one of the final appearances in WWF for Rude at the time, as after allegedly being told by Vince McMahon that his incredibly shredded body wasn't good enough and that if he wanted to have a future in the company he would need to take more steroids, he left to go back to WCW. And he wouldn't be the only one leaving around this time, as Jesse the Body Ventura would also cut bait after having a dispute with the boss about home video royalties for commentators, something he would later win a court case over. Setting this aside for now though, and focusing on what was happening in the ring, McMahon would start preparing for the second half of the year. A half that would see one of his top up-and-coming stars, Shawn Michaels, have to take time off to deal with a knee injury, all while, elsewhere on the show, the Texas Tornado continued to feud with Mr. Perfect over the IC title, and the Hart Foundation embarked on a lengthy run of tag title defenses. On top of this, Dusty Rhodes would continue his ongoing feud with Ted DiBiase, while Rick Martel would simultaneously be starting up a program with Jake the Snake Roberts after having temporarily blinded him with his signature cologne. This, of course, was all in the undercard though, and it was in the main event where, as usual, most of McMahon's focus lay. So it only made sense then that it was here where he used what he felt were his best ideas, having Hulk Hogan form a tag team with Tugboat to help him out in his continued wars with Earthquake, as elsewhere, the Ultimate Warrior was continuing his run on top, defending against opponents such as the Big Boss Man. That said, for as hard as the boss had been pushing him, by this point it was clear that the Warrior just wasn't working out as the next top star the company had hoped he would be. Of course, the reasons for this are numerous and can be argued until the cows come home, with many either blaming the continued presence of the Hulkster in the main event scene, or the weak roster of challengers the champion was forced to contend against after he'd offed Rick Rude in the summer. Others, however, have laid the blame for this failure squarely on the feet of Jim Hellwig, as they felt that, when given the ball to run with, he proved that he was little more than a one-trick pony, an exciting entrance who couldn't actually do what was needed in the ring when not being carried by a far superior opponent, and who didn't have either the temperament or the work ethic required to be the next Hulk Hogan. Whichever of these arguments you subscribe to though, the end result was the same. The Warrior just wasn't drawing, and so that was why, as the year began coming to a close, Vince McMahon began making plans to put the belt back on Hogan at the following year's WrestleMania, with him feeling then that the Hulkster would need a heel opponent to topple as he prepared to have Tugboat be the one to turn on him. Thankfully though, before Tugboat could be booked to become WWF champion, outside forces began to work their way into the wrestling industry as, with the Gulf War in Iraq picking up steam, the boss came up with the hugely controversial idea to have perennial American hero Sergeant Slaughter turn heel and become an Iraqi sympathizer. Of course, playing off a real-life war where many people had died was seen as tasteless by a lot of fans at the time, and the results of this angle would come back to bite the company when fan interest for WrestleMania 7 the following year reached all-time lows. That said, for the time being, McMahon remained convinced that this was the way to go forward as, for the second half of the year, Slaughter would draw the ire of fans everywhere he went, with things getting so bad at one point, fearful for his safety, he would be forced to come to shows with full personal security, all while wearing a bulletproof vest. Of course, thankfully, this was never needed, but it didn't stop the turncoat aligning himself with General Adnan anyway, and entering into a feud with everyone's favorite American hero, Nikolai Volkov, in the autumn. And this would eventually see both men captain opposing teams at November 22nd's Survivor Series, with Slaughter's union of mercenaries that included Tatanka, Sato, and Boris Zukov here coming up short against the alliance of Volkov, Tito Santana, and the Bushwhackers. But that wasn't all that was happening on the show, as elsewhere on the card, the Ultimate Warrior would limp on with his title run as his team defeated Mr. Perfect's, all while after that, Hulk Hogan would once again steal his spotlight when his union of Hulkamaniacs was able to topple the quartet made up of Earthquake, Dino Bravo, the Barbarian, and Haku. And that wouldn't be the end of the night for those combatants either, as this would be the year that WWF tried out the idea of having a grand finale match, which saw the winners of all the evening's prior bouts face off in one final showdown. And while this was an interesting idea, with it ending with Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior standing tall, it never really hit it off with fans, and so the whole thing would end up being scrapped the following year. But of course, as everyone now knows, the 1990 Survivor Series would ultimately be famous for one big debut, and that was the introduction of the Gobbledygooker. Yes, we know there was a bigger one than that, but the Gooker is worth mentioning regardless, as while he may not have stood the test of time, he's remained memorable amongst fans for being one of the worst gimmicks ever created, with the tease of the giant egg being hatched at the event being built up for weeks prior, then ending in the limpest possible fashion. And part of the reason for this disappointment was that there had been so much speculation from fans about who was in the egg during the lead-up, with some even going as far as to suggest it would be a big WCW star such as Ric Flair or Sting. So when it was revealed to be Hector Guerrero in a poorly designed turkey costume, then everyone groaned, with even Mean Gene Okerlund struggling to sell the whole thing after he awkwardly stumbled about the ring with the newest roster member for a while after this. So bad was the whole thing, in fact, that McMahon would instantly recognize the failure and scrap the character entirely, with him and Dusty Rhodes allegedly joking for years after about who had the worst idea, the Gobbledygooker or the equally as infamous Shockmaster. And of course, there was another, more important debut that night, one who would go on to become one of the biggest stars in WWF history, and that was The Undertaker. Yes, perhaps no surprise debut in the history of wrestling has ever delivered as much as when the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase came out prior to his team's match against Dusty Rhodes, the Hart Foundation, and Koko B. Ware to announce that his secret entrant, who would be brought to the ring by Brother Love, hailed from Death Valley itself and was there to destroy everyone in his path. Immediately after that, and the dead man came out through the curtain for the first time, striking fear into the hearts of children everywhere, as Vince McMahon and Roddy Piper sold the whole thing on commentary like the devil himself had just walked into the building. Even today, in fact, 30 years on, it's still chilling to watch, and just as effective then as it was now. Little did anyone know that this character, for as cool as it was on the night, would blow away even the most optimistic expectations by lasting for a full 3 decades thereafter, remaining at the top of the card throughout and becoming arguably the greatest gimmick in wrestling history in the process, eventually going on an unparalleled near 25-year win streak at WrestleMania that would begin the following year. Hell, come the next year, he would have even toppled the mighty Hulk Hogan to become WWF champion, but that was still a while away, as Hogan would have to wait until Sergeant Slaughter had defeated the Ultimate Warrior for the belt before he could get his own shot at it. And while the Iraqi Sympathizers title win wouldn't come until 1991, the seeds for this were very much being sown as 1990 drew to an end, with him beginning to feud with the champion on the house show circuit throughout December. As far as the other titles were concerned, the year would finish up with Mr. Perfect keeping hold of the Intercontinental strap, while elsewhere, the Hart Foundation would regain their tag team titles after a phantom win by the Rockers in October would be stricken from the record books. And for all the discussion of the main event situation being in such flux as the new decade dawned, with the attempt to pass the torch onto someone new failing so miserably as the company ended up having to fall back on older, more reliable stars, perhaps the thing to be taken from 1990 is that, by the end of it, the two men who would lead the company through its next era, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, were rising up to the point of getting into title programs themselves. Hell, it would be Hart who would eventually dethrone Perfect for the Intercontinental title at the following year's SummerSlam, so even if WWF didn't know it at the time, the failure of the Warrior didn't really matter in the long run, because their future remained secure regardless. Yet for all the promise that was blossoming in the mid-card, if we're reviewing how 1990 went for WWF, it was definitely a step down from years prior, with this probably marking the point where the Hulkamania era had peaked and was now beginning its downswing. But downswing or not, any year that gave us the babyface showdown of Hogan Warrior at WrestleMania, the curiosity of a WWF NJPW AJPW Super Show, and the debut of arguably the greatest character of all time in The Undertaker can't be considered a failure. And if you're going to go back and watch any of it, we'd definitely recommend the aforementioned WrestleMania title bout and Survivor Series debuts. But those aside, don't sleep on the often great matches that were being put on by the likes of Mr. Perfect and Randy Savage, the consistently great character work shown by Jake Roberts and Roddy Piper, or the pure charisma of the Road Warriors or Dusty Rhodes, because with the steroid trial looming, most of these names would be gone within the next couple of years, and as such, the company would be forced to enter a whole new generation altogether. Yes, ultimately, 1990 can be remembered as the beginning of the end for Hogan & Co., as with the quiet rise of the mid-card and the future coming fast, things would soon change forever in the WWF. But that's a story for another day. The year 1991 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of music, Nirvana released their iconic Nevermind record. In television, Home Improvement first hit the airwaves, and in film, we were first introduced to the likes of Terminator 2 and Boys in the Hood. Meanwhile, in the WWF, 1991 was the year that saw the promotion retreat into old habits of the late 80s, relying on older, more established stars and outdated storylines. But for all the controversy the latter of these would cause, that wasn't to say there weren't changes made during the second year of the 90s. No, it's here that we first saw the sparks of what the company would become, with an increased focus on higher numbers of big shows and regular title changes, as well as the rise of the man who would carry the new generation only a few years later in Bret Hart. So, how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1991, a year in review. When we last left off, WWF was trying to bounce back from the failure of the Ultimate Warrior to draw as world champion. So, already putting plans in place to take the title off him then, they'd begun setting up Sergeant Slaughter as his next challenger. In addition to that though, in a decision which would ultimately have negative consequences as the year went on, the company had chosen to try and play off the real-life Gulf War by having Slaughter turn heel and pledge his allegiance to Saddam Hussein, something which drew nuclear levels of heel heat for the Iraqi sympathizer and even forced him to wear a bulletproof vest on his way to the ring over fears that he may be shot at. And of course, there were many who were already calling this whole angle tasteless as the new year rolled around, but WWF stuck to their guns regardless, booking the former American hero to challenge the Warrior for the top prize at January 19th's Royal Rumble. Before we would get there though, the company would crown another new champion at a live event on January 7th when Perro Aguayo and Gran Hamada became the inaugural WWF Intercontinental Tag Team Champions. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of these belts before, well, you're not alone, because they would never have much of an impact, with them eventually getting deactivated altogether in July. But while the important belts would remain a fixture on TV, only one of them would be defended at the Royal Rumble itself, with this being the night that Slaughter mercifully put an end to the reign of the Ultimate Warrior after a screwy finish saw Macho Man Randy Savage get involved and cost the now former champ his title. And while this would see both men spin off into their own feud, elsewhere on the show, a young Shawn Michaels would continue his slow rise to the top when he and Marty Jannetty beat the Orient Express. All while, after that, Virgil would finally decide he'd had enough of Ted DiBiase's bullying when he turned on his boss after a tag match between them and The Rhodes, laying him out with his own $1 million title and leaving him for dead. Meanwhile, in the Rumble match itself, Bret Hart would put on an impressive showing after entering number 1 and lasting a full 20 minutes before being eliminated. That said, it would be Hulk Hogan who would get the win come the end of the night though, with this marking his second Rumble victory in a row as he established himself as the next contender to the WWF title in the lead-up to WrestleMania 7. That show, as it turned out, would have its own troubles behind the scenes as, partially due to the blowback from the Iraqi sympathizer storyline and partially due to general waning fan interest, ticket sales for the biggest show of the year would be disappointingly low, with this forcing the WWF to move the event from the planned Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to the nearby and far smaller Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena instead, a decision which the company would try to save face with by playing off as being the result of a bomb threat sent to the building ahead of time. Regardless of the venue though, when the show took place on March 24th, it would mark the first WrestleMania to not have Jesse Ventura as a commentator, with this, along with a new look, serving to make it feel like the first of a new era for the showcase of the Immortals. And in terms of the matches, on the undercard, the Nasty Boys would defeat the Hart Foundation for the tag team titles, while, elsewhere, The Undertaker would start his near 2.5-decade undefeated streak when he pinned Superfly Jimmy Snuka. On top of that, Jake the Snake Roberts would get the better of Rick Martel during their memorable blindfold match, just as, later on in the night, Virgil would finally get his revenge over Ted DiBiase when he pinned him after 7 minutes and 41 seconds. But that wasn't all that was going on during this bumper card, because in semi-main events, the Big Boss Man would beat Intercontinental Champion Mr. Perfect, albeit by disqualification, while prior to this, 2 former Intercontinental Champions would face off when the Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage settled their feud, with this eventually ending with the Warrior beating Savage and retiring him as per the pre-match stipulation in what may be the best match the former ever had. But that wasn't the most memorable part of this bout. No, it's the post-match most people think of now, as it was there where, after Sensational Sherry had turned on the Macho Man, Miss Elizabeth would come out of the crowd to help her former man, with this reuniting the couple on screen for the first time in 2 years in one of the most legitimately feel-good moments in WWF history. And if fans wanted more feel-good moments after that, they would be happy with the main event, as it was there that Hulk Hogan would end the 3-month reign of Sergeant Slaughter when he dropped the big leg on him, then pinned him 1, 2, 3 to become the new WWF champion. That said, if anyone thought the company would now learn their lesson and pivot away from the Iraqi sympathizer storyline, then they were dead wrong, as after the match, Slaughter would keep the feud going when he threw a fireball in the new champ's face during a post-match interview. But while that was still bubbling away, Randy Savage would honor the stipulation of his match against the Ultimate Warrior, as he would from there ease into retirement, taking up a position on color commentary as, in real life, he and Miss Elizabeth began trying to have a baby. As well as that, after their failure to hold on to the tag titles at WrestleMania, the Hart Foundation would split up, with this allowing Bret to finally go off on a singles run that would see him rise to the next level before the summer was out. Despite the Hitman's popularity though, he would not be part of the UK-only show UK Rampage 1991 on April 24th. No, there fans would instead see Hulk Hogan successfully defend his title against Sergeant Slaughter in the rematch from WrestleMania. All well, below them on the card, the British Bulldog would get a big home country win over the Berserker, and Shawn Michaels would continue his rise when the Rockers once again beat the Orient Express. Back stateside though, lots of fires were heating up as while WWF were moving to Titan Towers, their new corporate headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, they were simultaneously trying to manage a working relationship with Eastern promotions, Super World of Sports, and UWF Japan, regularly sending over big stars such as Randy Savage and Earthquake in a continued talent exchange. Perhaps more importantly than this, however, July of 1991 also marked the month where former WWF ringside physician Dr. George Zahorian would be found guilty on 12 counts of illegally selling anabolic steroids, 4 of which involved distribution to WWF superstars such as Rowdy Roddy Piper and Rick the Model Martel. And while the WWF steroid trial wouldn't come for another year yet, this would mark the point that things really started to hit the fan, and many behind the scenes grew increasingly worried about what was on the horizon. In the ring, however, all the focus was on the next big show of the year that was happening on August 26th, as it was there that, in front of a much healthier crowd of 20,000 people inside Madison Square Garden, SummerSlam would take place. And on that card, big changes would come as not only would the Legion of Doom defeat the Nasty Boys to become the new WWF Tag Team Champions, but Virgil would beat Ted DiBiase again, this time winning the $1 Million title from him. As well as that, Bret Hart would reach the next rung on the ladder to the top when, in what was undoubtedly the match of the night and maybe even the match of the year, he tapped out Mr. Perfect with a sharpshooter after 18 minutes and 4 seconds to become Intercontinental Champion for the first time. Elsewhere, the rest of the undercard would be filled out with the fun jailhouse match between the Big Boss Man and the Mountie, and the final US pay-per-view appearance of Andre the Giant, with him sadly dying only 2 years later. In terms of main events that night though, there were 2. First, there was the match made in hell where, in a 3-on-2 handicap match, Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, the latter of whom had been quietly building up a feud with a newly heeled Jake Roberts and The Undertaker on TV in recent months, would take on Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan, and Colonel Mustafa. But of course, while the babyfaces would win the match that night, no one really remembers that anymore. All they really remember instead is the fact that prior to the bout, the Warrior would demand a significant pay increase from Vince McMahon or he refused to perform, and that despite agreeing to this ahead of time, the boss felt this was done under duress, so he didn't have to honor it. That was why when the Warrior returned backstage at the close of the match, McMahon would fire him on the spot, with this ending up being the last time fans would see him until the following year. Luckily then, the other main event was a much happier one, as this was when, in the match made in heaven, Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth would have an in-ring wedding, with the real-life married couple now making it official in kayfabe too. Unfortunately though, at the reception afterwards, Jake Roberts and The Undertaker would make their presence felt when they crashed the proceedings, giving Elizabeth the gift of a live cobra and causing Savage to come out of retirement soon thereafter so as to get his revenge. But that wouldn't happen quite yet, and elsewhere, in the remaining aftermath of SummerSlam, Sergeant Slaughter would finally see the error of his ways when he turned babyface once again, with this coming after the Iraq War had ended and WWF felt there was no more juice left in the storyline. On top of that, Bret "Hitman" Hart would pick up another accolade when he won that year's King of the Ring at an untelevised event on September 7th, there going through Pete Doherty, Skinner, and Erwin R. Shyster en route to victory in the single-night tournament. And of course, this wouldn't be his only King of the Ring win during his career. Next time he won it, in fact, it would be at a pay-per-view event, but we'll get there eventually. Elsewhere at that year's tournament, though, the only other incident of note would be the continued rise of The Undertaker, who, still remaining undefeated at that point, would mow through opponents such as Animal and Sid Justice, all before a double DQ saw him be eliminated early while still getting to maintain his aura of invulnerability. And while he was doing this, his one-time ally, Jake Roberts, was now heavily involved in a full-blown feud with Randy Savage, something which grew even deeper in intensity when, at a WWF Superstars taping in the autumn, the Macho Man would leave the commentary booth and hit the ring to confront the Snake, only for him to end up getting tied up in the ropes and bitten by a live cobra, one which had been devenomized ahead of time but certainly hadn't been defanged. And this would lead to a gruesome scene that saw the Snake refuse to let go for an agonizing length of time as blood began seeping from the wound it had left behind, and children in the audience were left in tears. Of course, this would lead to Savage's in-ring return soon thereafter, but before we got there, WWF would return to the UK once more when they had their second special British show of the year, Battle Royal at the Albert Hall, an event which saw the Legion of Doom retain their tag team titles in a match against Power and Glory, whilst in the titular Battle Royal, hometown hero the British Bulldog would pick up the victory after last eliminating Typhoon. And the reason for these repeated tours of the UK at this time appeared to be that, while interest in their product was waning stateside, across the pond there was a hungry audience who were always desperate for more, something which would ultimately lead to SummerSlam being held at Wembley Stadium in front of a crowd of 80,000 people the following year. But back in 1991, Battle at the Royal Albert Hall would perhaps feature a moment of even greater historical importance, as it would see the first big WWF show to feature a match with Ric Flair. Yes, in a moment that sent shockwaves throughout the wrestling industry only weeks prior to this, the Nature Boy had quit WCW after a dispute with management about his direction going forward, with the company's boss at the time, Jim Herd, wanting him to cut his hair and take up a Spartacus gimmick. And as he was in possession of the WCW World title at the time of his release then, rather than give it back to them, Rick simply brought the belt to New York with him as, with Bobby Heenan now by his side, he would proclaim himself to be the real world's champion, not some fake pretender like he believed Hulk Hogan to be. And of course, this seemed to be sowing the seeds of an eventual dream match between Flair and Hogan to see who was really the best, but before that could really get going, the Hulkster would have to contend with another challenger, as at November 27th Survivor Series, he would be forced to take on the new #1 contender to his title, The Undertaker. Yes, after only a year on the roster, the Deadman had become such a hit with fans that he was already being placed in the title picture. That said, given Hogan's reign of dominance and the fact that he'd only just won the belt back at WrestleMania, most believed he would somehow find a way to overcome the odds. In the end though, when the time for the match came on, The Undertaker continued to be just as undefeatable as his manager Paul Bearer repeatedly told everyone he was, as with a little help from Ric Flair and a well-placed steel chair, he would hit the champion with a tombstone piledriver, then pin him in the middle of the ring to start his first reign on top of the mountain. And while that was going on, the remainder of the show would be primarily made up of traditional 4-on-4 Survivor Series elimination matches, with the newly babyface Sergeant Slaughter cementing his good guy ways once again in one of these, as he teamed up with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, the Texas Tornado, and Tito Santana to defeat Colonel Mustafa, the Berserker, Skinner, and Hercules. Elsewhere, the Nature Boy would hit the ring himself when he continued the TV feud he'd been brewing up with Roddy Piper around this time, as the Real World's champion teamed with the Mountie, Ted DiBiase, and the Warlord to defeat Piper, Bret Hart, the British Bulldog, and Virgil. And this match, as it happened, would also further another program, as by then, the Mountie had his sights set on firmly taking the Intercontinental title away from the Hitman. As for the tag team champions, the Legion of Doom, well, they'd team with the Big Boss Man to get a victory over the Natural Disasters and Erwin R. Shyster in a bout that was also supposed to feature Sid Justice on the side of the babyfaces too, until an elbow injury took him out of action at the last minute. So with Jake Roberts originally scheduled to have been the fourth member of the heel team at this point, Randy Savage began campaigning to be the new man on the other side so that he could finally get his revenge on the Snake. Ultimately, though, that would have to wait, even if only for a few days. Yes, in an interesting promotional move, the WWF had decided to try out running another big pay-per-view in 1991, one which would take place just 6 days after Survivor Series, effectively making that the go-home show to the December 3rd one entitled This Tuesday in Texas. And in kayfabe, the reason for this show existing was that after the controversy surrounding the screwy title win The Undertaker had picked up, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney announced that Hogan would be getting his rematch at this very event, and that he would be there at ringside himself to stop any further interference. But that wasn't all that was happening on this show, as it would also be here that the Macho Man finally got to come out of retirement and get his hands on Jake Roberts, in a bout that ended up being arguably the most heated one on the card, and which saw Savage absolutely pummel his opponent for the full 6 minutes it lasted. Despite getting the victory here though, during the post-match, Roberts would get a measure of revenge himself when he not only hit his rival with 3 DDTs, but also slapped Miss Elizabeth across the face too, in a scene which caused a lot of raised eyebrows at the time and allowed the feud to continue. Elsewhere, Bret Hart would successfully defend his Intercontinental title against Skinner, while in dark matches, Ric Flair and Roddy Piper would finally blow off their beef, and the Legion of Doom would retain their tag team titles in a match against the Rockers. And of course, part of what contributed towards the Rockers' ultimate loss that night would be the growing dissension between the two, dissension which would eventually come to a head in a memorable barbershop segment that, while not aired until January 2nd, was actually filmed later that night. But of course, it was the main event that most people had paid their ticket price for, so that was where the primary focus lay for them. With that in mind then, when the Hulkster and the Phenom finally hit the ring at the end of the show, excitement was at a high. And the match that followed would give fans exactly what they wanted, as for the next 13 minutes and 9 seconds, both men would go to war. About midway through the proceedings, however, Ric Flair would once again come to ringside, seemingly intent on interfering just as he had 6 days earlier. But of course, with Jack Tunney there now, he was able to thwart this, though that didn't stop Hogan from making doubly sure by smacking the Nature Boy across the back with a steel chair himself, this causing him to fall into Tunney and leave both men knocked out. After that, and the challenger would stop Paul Bearer from interfering too, when the latter attempted to hit him across the head with his urn. And from there, Hogan would take possession of the urn himself, emptying out its ashy contents and throwing these into the face of The Undertaker, this being enough to allow him to get the pinfall and the title back around his waist. That said, this fourth reign on top for the Hulkster wouldn't last long as, given the once again controversial nature of the finish, Jack Tunney would strip him of the belt and declare it vacant days later, with him from there announcing that a new champion would be decided at the upcoming January 1992 Royal Rumble. Yes, it was a hell of a cliffhanger to end the year on, and one which did its job in getting fans to return for the Rumble the next month. That said, 1992 would end up being one of the worst years in the company's history, as it was then that the steroid trial would get going fully, with this causing the landscape to change dramatically as the era of the roided-up muscle men came to a crashing end. Luckily though, throughout 1991, two of the men who would keep WWF afloat during this dark period were already rising to the top, with Bret Hart riding high as the Intercontinental Champion and Shawn Michaels about to go on a career-defining heel run of his own. As well as that, the second year of the decade had done an excellent job in setting up what many people believe to be the inevitable showdown between Mr. WWF Hulk Hogan and Mr. WCW Ric Flair. And while this match would never end up making it past the house show circuit, at that point, fans were fully behind what they saw coming up in the main event picture. Yes, while the company had faltered earlier in the year, with the Iraqi sympathizer angle turning many people off, it seemed like by the year's end, the wheels were starting to get back on the track, as The Undertaker had become a full-blown main event force now too, all while the likes of Sid Justice were waiting in the wings for their own shot. On top of this, while fans had lost the Ultimate Warrior for the time being, they had regained an old hero in Randy Savage to make up for it, so all felt good at last. How little did we all know at the time then that over the next 12 months, everything would change. The year 1992 brought us a lot of great things. In films, we first saw Wayne's World, in music, Dr. Dre brought us The Chronic, and in the WWF, things would really start to evolve. Yes, with the steroid trial heating up and causing the landscape of the company to change forever, and whether he liked it or not, a new generation was about to dawn for Vince McMahon, but first, he would have to let go of the old one. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1992, a year in review. When we last left off, the WWF title had been vacated after the controversial finish to the Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker match at this Tuesday in Texas. And as a result of this, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney had decided that a new champion would be decided at the upcoming Royal Rumble as, for the first time in history, the belt would actually be on the line in the titular match itself. And of course that led to a lot of people vying for a spot in the match, with babyfaces and heels alike staking their claims in the weeks that followed. One of the most notable of these, in fact, was Shawn Michaels, as with the Rockers having had their own internal difficulties in the months leading up to this, he would finally turn heel on his partner in a barbershop interview segment that aired in early January, super kicking Party Marty, then throwing him through a glass window in a moment that would become the defining one of his career up until that point. Elsewhere, other feuds carrying into the big match were Jake Roberts and Randy Savage's ongoing beef, The Undertaker's continued reign of dominance, Roddy Piper's desire to become a double champion, and Ric Flair's program with Hulk Hogan. So, with all this going on, it's no surprise that the Rumble itself that night on January 19th turned out to be a 5-star classic, with many still considering it the best of all the Rumble matches to this day. Before it took place, though, the undercard would see the Natural Disasters beat the tag team champions, the Legion of Doom, via countout, while prior to that, Roddy Piper had become the Intercontinental Champion, beating the Mountie after Bret Hart was stricken with a bad bout of the flu and had been forced to drop the title days before. And this, as it happened, would mark Piper's first ever title win in WWF, with him from there entering the 30-man Battle Royal later on in the night with the intention of winning the world title too. But the story of the 1992 Royal Rumble ultimately isn't about Roddy Piper. No, it's about Ric Flair, because he would undoubtedly steal the show that night, proving once again that he was probably the best wrestler in the world at this point as, after entering at number 3, he would spend the next hour in the ring, battling out with everyone and showcasing the full extent of his endurance skills in a performance that very nearly turned him babyface. Yes, it didn't matter who he came up against. The British Bulldog, Ted DiBiase, Jim Duggan, Sid Justice. He survived them all and, on more than a few occasions, was even able to eliminate them. All while at ringside, Bobby Heenan would be putting on the performance of his career at the commentary booth. When Hulk Hogan finally made his entrance at number 26, however, most fans assumed that the party was over for the Nature Boy. How little did they know then, because when it came down to the final 3, Flair was still there, alongside the Hulkster and Justice. And in an even bigger shocker, in a moment that actually drew cheers from the live crowd, Sid would eliminate Hogan, with this causing the babyface to begin acting like a spoilt child as he from there sulked at ringside and grabbed the arm of the man who had fairly thrown him out, with this allowing the Nature Boy to sneak up behind him and dump him out too so as to win the whole thing. Yes, with a tear in his eye, Ric Flair was the new WWF champion. But while he was celebrating this backstage, the Hulkster would continue to bicker with Sid Justice in the ring, something which was done to set up a WrestleMania feud between the two. Of course, fans had originally wanted to see Flair vs. Hogan at the biggest show of the year, but by then, with the match failing to draw well on the house show circuit, Vince McMahon decided to pull the plug on the whole thing, with him setting up Hogan vs. Justice in a grudge match instead, while elsewhere on the card, Flair and Randy Savage would face off for the title. But the more immediate concern for him that night was the heel reaction his top star had gotten towards the end of the match, something which suggested that fans were finally tiring of Hulk's babyface antics. And that wouldn't be the only headache the boss would have to deal with over the next couple of months, as, with the steroid trial really beginning to heat up, he would be forced to close down his burgeoning bodybuilding league, the World Bodybuilding Federation, something he'd started a couple of years prior in hopes of branching out from the wrestling industry. Yes, knowing that he was likely going to be indicted soon, McMahon felt like running a company full of the most roided-up men in America would be a bad look for him, so for now, the likes of Gary Stridham and Lex Luger would have to take a back seat as the boss instead refocused all of his attention on the WWF. And the next big show they had coming up was WrestleMania 8 on April 5th, where aside from the two big main events, the undercard would see Bret Hart regain his Intercontinental title in an absolutely excellent match with Roddy Piper that would see Piper do the honors in a rare pinfall loss. Elsewhere, the Natural Disasters would defeat Money Inc. for the tag team titles, while Shawn Michaels would pick up a win over Tito Santana in a match that was originally supposed to see the Heartbreak Kid defeat Marty Jannetty, but which had to be changed at the last minute after Party Marty got himself fired during the lead-up. On top of that, The Undertaker would make Jake Roberts the second victim of the streak after Roberts threatened to no-show the event unless he was released from his contract immediately afterwards, with him claiming here that he'd been promised a role on WWF's creative team prior to the event, only for this to then be rescinded once Pat Patterson returned to the company following the Ring Boy scandal. Things would go better in the first main event, however, as there, Ric Flair would defend the WWF title against Macho Man Randy Savage, with the two putting on the second classic of the night, as they spent the next 18 minutes battling it out. Come the end, though, it would be Savage who would be victorious, holding the company's top prize above his head for the second time as Ric Flair lay on the mat, a bloodied and battered mess. And in the final match of the night, Hulk Hogan would meet Sid Justice in a bout that had been promoted as possibly being the Hulkster's last leading into it. Yes, it seemed like, reading the temperature of the room in terms of the looming steroid trial and the growing number of boos he was receiving, Hogan had realized it was time to take a leave of absence from the WWF and let fans miss him for a while. That was why he planned to disappear after WrestleMania, but not before defeating Sid once and for all. Sadly, though, this match is more memorable now for the massively botched ending that saw Papa Shango miss his cue to do a run-in at the end, forcing Sid to instead become the first man to ever kick out of the leg drop of doom. When Shango did finally get to the ring, however, things would get back on track, as while the two heels were laying a beat down to the Hulkster, the Ultimate Warrior's music would hit, signaling his return to the company as, much to the delight of fans, he ran down to the ring to save the babyface and send the crowd home happy. Yes, even if Hogan were going to be gone for a while, at least the fans had the Warrior back, and so all seemed right with the world at the close of the show. Off-screen, though, concerns were growing as, despite the event having been promoted as a huge one, ticket sales were soft for the second year running, with an estimated 15,000 tickets having to be given out for free prior to the show so as to fill up the stadium. And to make matters worse, not only were Hogan and Jake Roberts gone, but both Roddy Piper and Sid Justice would also take hiatuses soon after WrestleMania, with this marking the first of many waves who would be missing come the end of the year. Still, the company had to push forward anyway, as they had another UK show coming up in April, UK Rampage 1992, that would see the British Bulldog once again play the hometown hero, defeating Irwin R. Shyster in the main event, while elsewhere on the card, Randy Savage would defend the WWF title against Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart would retain his Intercontinental title against Rick Martel. And by this point, it was becoming clearer and clearer to WWF officials that, whenever they crossed the Atlantic, the Hitman was being treated like arguably their biggest star, something that the boss would take careful note of when he had to make a big decision later in the year. But it wasn't just Bret that the British loved. No, they were going wild for everyone as it turned out, and that was part of the reason why, with fan interest in the US continuing to wane, Vince McMahon decided to take his second biggest show of the year on the road, and for the first time ever, hold a major WWF pay-per-view outside of North America. Yes, on August 29th of 1992, SummerSlam would emanate from Wembley Stadium in London, England, with the rafters being packed here so as to hold a crowd of 80,000, WWF's legit largest attendance ever at that point. And hoping to equally play to markets on both sides of the pond then, the company would feature another double main event that night. One for the US fans that would see Randy Savage defend the WWF title against the Ultimate Warrior, and one for the UK fans that would see Bret Hart and the British Bulldog battle it out over the Intercontinental title. But that wasn't all that was happening on the stacked card that night, as, in the opener, the Legion of Doom would receive a Road Warrior-worthy pop as they came out to lay waste to Money Inc. All well, following this, Nails would establish himself as a threat to watch out for by beating Virgil, and Shawn Michaels and Rick Martel would go to a double countout. As well as that, the Natural Disasters would defend their tag team titles against the Beverly Brothers, and The Undertaker would pick up a win over Kamala. That said, it was the main events that people really cared about, and the first of those would come when the Macho Man put the WWF title up for grabs in his bout with the Ultimate Warrior, a match that had slowly been building up during the months prior as, after returning to the company in April, the Warrior had immediately set his sights on reclaiming the belt that had once been his. But of course, at that point, Ric Flair was still involved in the title picture too, as with his rematch clause in place, he'd spent the spring trying to get it back from the man who had beaten him at WrestleMania. Ultimately though, the Nature Boy would not be able to win any of these matches, and so the Warrior was considered next in line, something which only served to infuriate the former WCW star. So, hoping to get in the heads of both men then, Flair and his executive consultant Mr. Perfect would attempt to sow the seeds of doubt ahead of the WWF title match, with them claiming that one of the participants had agreed to accept the managerial services of Perfect going forward and that their identity would be revealed on the night of SummerSlam itself. And while Savage and the Warrior would try to put this aside when the time came for the bell to ring, it was clear to see that it was on their minds as each worried about whether they would be getting screwed over come the end of the match. Still, with the company's top prize on the line, they battled it out as best they could, trading the advantage back and forth until, around the halfway mark of the bout, Flair and Perfect would walk down to the ring, from there seeming to help out the challenger, only to then lay him out once the referee had been knocked out too. So by this point, realizing that they were only there to cause trouble and had no interest in recruiting either man, the Macho Man would attack Flair, only for the Nature Boy to get the better of him here when he hit him across the leg with a steel chair at the ringside area. And this left the champion unable to get back in the ring before the 10 count, meaning that the Ultimate Warrior would win the match but would not win the title as it had happened on a countout. And of course, fans weren't happy with this ending of the night, given its inconclusive nature, but luckily for them, there was an even bigger match to come, as after that, fan favorite Bret Hitman Hart would defend his Intercontinental title against hometown hero the British Bulldog, in a match that was designed to send the live crowd home happy. What they didn't realize though was that, in the days prior to the bout, the Bulldog had spent most of his waking hours doing crack cocaine with Jim Neidhart, and so had forgotten everything he and Bret had planned for the match. And were it a lesser wrestler in the ring with him then, the whole thing would have fallen apart. Luckily though, the Hitman was already by this point approaching GOAT status, and so he was able to carry Davey Boy through the whole thing, playing the subtle heel and putting on what many still consider to be a career best performance as, by the end of it, the hometown boy would get the pin and the Intercontinental title to an absolutely massive pop. Yes, it was a crowning moment for Davey Boy Smith, and in a better world, this would have been his springboard to the top of the card. Sadly though, his drug issues would see him be fired not long after this, with the Ultimate Warrior quickly following him out the door too, as Vince McMahon began to tighten up his policies with the steroid trial drawing ever nearer. And the Warrior's exit also required a last-minute change in storyline as, with him and Randy Savage already being booked to face off against Ric Flair and Razor Ramon at the upcoming Survivor Series at that point, it would mean a familiar figure would have to come out of retirement and thus turn babyface once more in his absence. Before any of this would happen though, further big changes would be on the horizon for the WWF, because at a TV taping in Hershey, Pennsylvania on September 1st, the Macho Man would drop the WWF title to the Nature Boy. This reign, though, would only be a temporary one, as it turned out, because at a live event in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan just a month later on October 12th, Bret Hart would pin Flair in a surprise victory to start his own first run with the top prize. Yes, with Hulk Hogan seemingly gone for good by now, and the Ultimate Warrior no longer being a fallback option, Vince McMahon had been forced to decide who his next top babyface was going to be. And in the end, it came down to a short list which allegedly included names like the Texas Tornado, Crush, and even Tatanka. Based on how much support he was getting from European fans though, and how well he could perform in the ring, the boss chose to go with Hart instead, with this ushering in the beginning of a new, higher work rate era for the company's main event scene going forward. But the title win itself wouldn't be seen by fans for a while afterwards as, with it not happening at a TV taping and this being before the age of camera phones, footage was hard to come by. So when the Hitman showed up at a Superstars taping as the new WWF champion soon after, fans were confused but went with it anyway, happy to accept them as their new top guy. But that wasn't the only belt that was changing hands around this time as, with the British Bulldog no longer able to keep up his commitments as Intercontinental Champion, he would be forced to drop it to Shawn Michaels on his way out the door. And this would set up another interesting match for the upcoming Survivor Series show as, once again, the company would book a champion versus champion match, this time with only the world title on the line, and featuring the two superstars who would go on to carry the company for the next few years. Of course, even that wasn't the original plan though, as the plan had originally been for HBK to defend his IC title against a returning Marty Jannetty at this show. Before that could happen, however, Hardy Marty would predictably get fired again, with this keeping up his reputation as someone who just couldn't get out of his own way to let himself succeed. So while Bret and Shawn were getting ready to have their first Survivor Series match when the time for the show came on November 25th, the undercard would feature the Big Boss Man facing off against Nails, a purported former prisoner with a voice modulator who claimed that the babyface cop had inflicted police brutality on him while he was behind bars. And this would see the two fight it out in a nightstick on a pole match where, after 6 minutes, the Boss Man would send the jailbird packing. And unhappy with both this result and his apparently small payout after the match, Nails would confront Vince McMahon in his office afterwards, with the whole thing quickly getting heated from there, as he would allegedly try to strangle the boss, with this causing him to abruptly get fired from the company. Thankfully then, the next few matches wouldn't end in such high drama, as while Tatanka was keeping his undefeated streak alive with a win over Rick Martel, Randy Savage was introducing his new partner, Mr. Perfect, who, after having had a confrontation with Ric Flair on the November 16th episode of Primetime Wrestling, had once again turned to the side of the good guys. And with this new alignment in place, both he and the Macho Man would pick up a disqualification win over the Nature Boy and Razor Ramon that night, all while elsewhere, The Undertaker defeated Kamala in the company's first ever coffin match. New signing Yokozuna continued to build momentum as a monster heel when he pinned Virgil in just 3 minutes, and in the lone 4-on-4 Survivor Series elimination match of the night, the Natural Disasters and the Nasty Boys would defeat Money Inc. and the Beverly Brothers. Yes, WWF had clearly decided by this point that a card filled with elimination matches wasn't a big enough draw anymore, and so that's why, from here on in, Survivor Series would focus more on singles bouts. And the best singles bout of the night was still to come as it happened, because in the main event, we would get to see the WWF Champion and the Intercontinental Champion square off in a match that showed fans what the future of the company was going to be. And while this one is often forgotten in favor of their far more famous Survivor Series match from 5 years later, it was absolutely the better of the two from an in-ring perspective, with Bret getting to establish himself as a strong champion here, all while HBK proved he could hang in the main event scene. Of course, by the end it would be the Hitman who would retain, closing out the last big show of the year as the company's new top star. But with big new challengers such as Yokozuna on the horizon, he would have his work cut out for him if he wanted to remain in that position going forward. But that was news for 1993, because in terms of 92, things had drawn to a close. And what a transformative year it had been for WWF. It had begun with a main event scene dominated by the likes of Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, and Sid Justice, and had ended with that very same scene now being filled with performers such as Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Yes, a lot of this was due to the upcoming steroid trial that saw the bigger physiques of yesteryear begin to get phased out and a new, more athletic style become the focus. But that shouldn't negate the fact that Bret and Shawn absolutely earned their spot, as by then, they were arguably the two best wrestlers in the entire company. So while it may not be the most fondly remembered year in WWF history, it's probably one of the most important, as it showed that, when forced to make a change, McMahon was still able to adapt, and while financially there were tough times ahead for the company, the in-ring product was, in some ways, about to get better than it ever had been before. The year 1993 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we saw Season 1 of Frasier. In film, True Romance first hit theaters. And in the WWF, we saw a roller coaster year full of highs and lows. Yes, if 1992 was the year where the last dying embers of the Hulkamania era were supposed to have burnt out, then 1993 was supposed to represent the shift into a new generation for WWF. And while in many ways this would happen, with smaller, more athletic stars solidifying their spot on top of the card and new weekly TV shows making their debut, sometimes letting go of the past is a hard thing to do. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1993, a year in review. When we last left off, a new WWF champion had been crowned in the form of Bret "Hitman" Hart, someone who, with his ability to put on a different, more technical style of match to what fans were used to, had been able to capture fans' hearts in the wake of the loss of prior big names like Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, Jake Roberts, the British Bulldog, and Sid Justice. And it wasn't long then before the company had started to adapt around their new top star with similar styles of matches, something that was double important now, as on January 11th, Vince McMahon would debut his latest creation, Monday Night Raw, a weekly TV show that would air on primetime from the Manhattan Center and which would break new ground for televised wrestling by offering more than mere squash matches. Instead, this one would regularly push storylines forward and would feature early classics such as Mr. Perfect and Ric Flair's Loser Leaves Town match, the very match that ended up being the Nature Boys' swan song to the company for the time being. It would also be the show that saw a huge return in the wake of an even huger loss just a month later, but before we would get there, the Royal Rumble would take place on January 24th. And as one of the more highly anticipated shows of the year by this point, WWF felt the need to load this card up, with it finally featuring the long-awaited showdown between Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty over the Intercontinental title. But of course, despite managing to keep his job for long enough to get the bout in the ring this time, in the end, HBK was on too much of a roll to be defeated on the night, with him hitting his rival with a super kick after just over 14 minutes to put the whole thing to bed. And as he was doing this, elsewhere on the card, the Steiner brothers were making their WWF pay-per-view debut a successful one when they picked up a win over the Beverly brothers. All while, in the WWF title picture, Bret Hart was racking up another title defense as he was able to get the better of his opponent, Razor Ramon. After that, fans would get introduced to another new face when Lex Luger, who had previously been employed by Vince McMahon's short-lived World Bodybuilding Federation, would make the jump back over to the world of wrestling when he was unveiled under the new gimmick name of The Narcissist by his manager going forward, Bobby Heenan. That said, the real main event of the night, though, was the 30-man Royal Rumble match where, this year, an added stipulation would see the winner get a shot at the WWF title in the main event of the upcoming WrestleMania, a stipulation which proved to be so popular that it would end up continuing on to the present day. So, with even more on the line than normal then, every contestant in the match gave it their all, hoping to book their shot against the Hitman at the Showcase of the Immortals. Despite some impressive efforts though, including a 1 hour, 1 minute and 10-second run from Bob Backlund and another dominating performance from The Undertaker, it would be Yokozuna who would come out the victor by the end, last eliminating Macho Man Randy Savage as he from there set his sights on taking down the champ in April. Yes, the WrestleMania World title picture seemed set, but as we mentioned before, a big return and an even bigger loss would come before then that would throw a spanner in the works as, on January 27th, the wrestling world would sadly say goodbye to one of its biggest stars, both literally and metaphorically, when the legendary Andre the Giant passed away at just 46 years old, his death ultimately coming as a result of congestive heart failure. So to honor the man who had done so much for the company then, later that year on March 22nd, Andre would become the inaugural inductee into the WWF Hall of Fame. Elsewhere though, the pain of this loss would be numbed somewhat for fans when, on the February 22nd episode of Raw, Hulk Hogan would make his return to the company, from there teaming up with his real-life friend Brutus the Barber Beefcake as the two got involved in a program with Money Inc. And this would lead to the biggest show of the year on April 4th where, in the parking lot of Caesars Palace on the Las Vegas Strip, WWF put on a show that was considered the worst WrestleMania ever by many at the time. Of course, being in such a small location compared to other years didn't help with this either, as with interest at an all-time low, the boss struggled to create any meaningful buzz around the show, even with the in-ring return of the Hulkster taking place. And part of the reason for this was that, for the most part, the card was pretty lacking, with Shawn Michaels having probably his worst WrestleMania match against Tatanka, all while, elsewhere, Razor Ramon was handing Bob Backlund his first ever pinfall loss in WWF, Lex Luger was putting on an unimpressive performance against Mr. Perfect, and The Undertaker was continuing his undefeated streak with an absolute stinker disqualification victory over Giant Gonzalez. That's not to say that there weren't bright spots though, as the show did feature the debut of Jim Ross on commentary. And on top of that, Hulk Hogan would indeed make a successful return when he and Brutus Beefcake were able to get the upper hand on Money Inc. But while this match took place on the undercard, coming out of the show, Hogan would remain the name on everyone's lips as, after Yokozuna was able to defeat Bret Hart to win the WWF title in the main event, the Hulkster would come out to challenge him to an impromptu match, from there defeating the heel in just 22 seconds to start his fifth reign on top. Yes, it may have sent the crowd home happy on the night, but by the next day it was already clear how short-sighted of a move this had been, as not only had the Hitman and Yokozuna, two stars of the future, been sacrificed to make way for more Hulkamania, but Hogan was only planning on returning to the company on a short-time basis anyway, as with the steroid trial continuing to heat up and his movie career still burgeoning, he felt he couldn't commit full-time. So the plan initially then was for Hogan to drop the belt to the Hitman at the upcoming SummerSlam pay-per-view, putting the new generation over strong as he then moved on to other ventures. Before that could happen though, the Hulkster would have a change of heart, allegedly telling Bret that he was out of his league and that he would only drop the belt to Yokozuna instead, something which understandably left the Canadian feeling disrespected. Before that title change would happen, however, the five-time champion would take the belt over to Japan, where he would wrestle the at-the-time IWGP champion, the Great Buddha, in front of 55,000 fans at the Fukuoka Dome, there displaying a previously unseen level of technical in-ring skill that saw him wrestle in a catch-as-catch-can style. After the match, though, he would court controversy when he declared the WWF title to be nothing more than a toy, as what he really wanted was the IWGP title, something which didn't leave Vince McMahon happy back over in America. But he had his own problems to deal with at this point, because the WWF were on another tour of the UK, attempting to capitalize on their popularity there with an underwhelming show that saw Crush defeat Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger defeat Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And once back in the States, they would try to revive interest by having a number of title changes take place on house shows, attempting to sell audiences here on the fact that, if they went to a live show, then they might just see something special. Of course, none of these title changes would stand for long though, as, after having defeated Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental title on the May 17th episode of Raw, Marty Jannetty would end up dropping the belt right back at a house show on June 6th. All while, during the same period, the Steiner Brothers and Money Inc. would be trading the tag team titles back and forth as well. And all of these title changes would end up leading on to the next big pay-per-view of the year on June 13th, the King of the Ring. Yes, the King of the Ring had been a popular show on the live event circuit for years by this point, so hoping to turn it into a regular big show then, WWF would add it to their pay-per-view calendar, with the inaugural one seeing Bret Hart, Razor Ramon, Mr. Perfect, Mr. Hughes, Bam Bam Bigelow, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Lex Luger, and Tatanka all fight it out in a single elimination one-night tournament. But while this was going on, elsewhere on the show, Shawn Michaels would be defending his newly regained Intercontinental title against Crush, while in the WWF title picture, Yokozuna and Hulk Hogan would have their long-awaited rematch, with this one seeing the heel eventually get the win and the title back after the Hulkster was temporarily blinded by Harvey Whippleman masquerading as a cameraman at ringside. Yes, if Bret couldn't be the one to beat him, at least Yoko had gotten the rub, as from there, Hogan would disappear from WWF TV for the next 9 years, leaving the now two-time champ to tell the world that he had indeed killed Hulkamania. But if he thought he was going to have an easy time as champion going forward, he was dead wrong, because challengers were already lining themselves up, and none more so than the Hitman who, back in the King of the Ring tournament, would put on one of his career best performances when he had 3 very different and equally brilliant matches against Razor Ramon, Mr. Perfect, and Bam Bam Bigelow, defeating the latter in the finals to become the 2-time King of the Ring. Unfortunately for him, though, any thoughts of returning to the WWF title picture would be temporarily sidelined when, as he was being coronated after the match, Hart would get interrupted by Jerry the King Lawler, who, taking umbrage with the fact that he wasn't the only king in WWF anymore, would get in the Hitman's face, all before laying him out with a scepter. And this would see the two spin off into a feud that would last for some time after that, as, at one point, both Bret and his brother Owen would take the fight over to Lawler's home territory on the United States Wrestling Association. And they wouldn't be the only ones to do this either, because Vince McMahon himself would get in on things, making a few appearances in Memphis as a prototypical version of the later evil Mr. McMahon character he would so famously use as a foil for Steve Austin. Yes, it's strange to see full megalomaniacal heel boss Vince McMahon on display right there in 1993, but there it is regardless. And while few would have seen it at the time, it stands as an important historical moment as it allowed him to develop the character that would later help propel WWF towards previously unseen levels of success. Back in the WWF, though, things would be heating up, as with Yokozuna now the WWF champion once more, and Bret Hart sidelined with other concerns, a new challenger was going to be needed. So that was why, on July 4th, a special event would be set up on the deck of the USS Intrepid, where Yokozuna and his manager Mr. Fuji laid out the challenge to anyone who wanted a shot: body slam the champion and stake your claim to his belt. And of course, many would attempt to lift the foreign menace that afternoon, with both WWF performers and outside athletes trying and ultimately failing to do so in the end. Luckily then, just when all hope seemed lost, Lex Luger would arrive via a helicopter, from there making his way up to the champion and body slamming him with ease, something which came much to the delight of those on board. But wait, wasn't Lex Luger a narcissist heel? Well, yes, and as such, the whole babyface turn out of nowhere did come off as somewhat whiplash-inducing. That said, feeling like Hulk Hogan was now well and truly gone from the company, Vince McMahon had decided he needed to create a new American hero for audiences to get behind, and who better in his mind than the muscular Luger? So, setting off on a PR tour to win fans' hearts from there then, Lex would jump on board the Lex Express, a tour bus that took him from state to state over the next few weeks as he shook some hands, kissed some babies, and staked his claim to being the #1 contender for Yoko's title at the upcoming SummerSlam. And at one point it even seemed like Luger was going to be the man to beat the heel champion at the big show, from there starting his run as the new face of the company. That's certainly what he thought was going to happen, if you believe the rumors, that is, because, as the story goes, prior to SummerSlam, he would get drunk in a bar and blab to a reporter about the planned finish of the big title match, with this then leaking out to the public and causing WWF to change course. Of course, others will argue that this wasn't true and that Vince McMahon had his own reasons for the finish he'd selected when the time came for SummerSlam on August 30th, but either way, come the end of that show, it was clear that something had shaken his faith in Luger as a top guy. Before we would get there, though, the undercard would see the Steiner brothers once again defend their tag team titles against the Beverly brothers, while elsewhere, in a match that had been brewing since WrestleMania 9, Shawn Michaels would pick up a countout win over Mr. Perfect, keeping the Intercontinental title around his waist in the process. On top of that, the 1-2-3 Kid would build on his historic win over Razor Ramon on an episode of Raw prior to this when he went up against Erwin R. Shyster. All while, pulling double duty for the night, Bret Hart would face off against both Doink the Clown and Jerry Lawler in separate matches, defeating the first with relative ease, all before then losing to the King immediately afterwards via disqualification. Yes, it wasn't quite the win over Hulk Hogan he'd initially been promised, but Bret would soldier through regardless, continuing to prove that, even if he wasn't in the main event, he was still the best and most over wrestler on the roster regardless. But while his career was stalling, another's was on the rise, as Ludwig Borga would make short work of Marty Jannetty, with him clearly being set up then to be another foreign menace challenger for Lex Luger after SummerSlam. And in terms of lengthy runs, things wouldn't fare much better for Giant Gonzalez because, fresh off the heels of his awful WrestleMania match against The Undertaker, the duo would return for round 2 on this show, with things not faring much better here as, after 8 minutes and 4 seconds, the Deadman would mercifully put the feud to bed once and for all while regaining the mystical urn that had been stolen from him prior to the bout. So after that stinker then, all hopes were on the main event to bring the show back up as, there, Lex Luger would finally get his chance to take on Yokozuna one-on-one with the WWF title on the line. That said, despite the obvious ending to this story being the American hero bringing the belt back for the good guys, this wouldn't happen. Sure, Luger would win, but only via countout, leaving him to then celebrate in the ring like an idiot as confetti and balloons rained from the ceiling and the roster of babyfaces lifted him up on their shoulders. Yes, the new Hulk Hogan didn't seem to realize that the title couldn't change hands on a countout and that he'd actually failed at his goal. Fans noticed though, and while it would later come out that the plan was for the company to hold off until WrestleMania 10 for Lex's big coronation, after that night, the damage was already done in the moment past, something which would be evident in his waning crowd reactions going forward. But Lex Luger's main event hopes weren't the only thing that came to a crushing end at SummerSlam that year, as the show would also mark the final WWF appearance as Ted DiBiase as an active wrestler. On top of that, Matt Osborne, the original portrayer of Doink the Clown, would see himself get fired soon after this too, as his drug problems spiraled out of control. And as if this wasn't enough, legendary interviewer Mean Gene Okerlund would make his exit around this point too, as he became one of the first big names to jump ship to WCW, a problem that would only get worse for WWF in the years that followed. Elsewhere, while that was happening, Shawn Michaels would be forced to vacate the Intercontinental title after he'd been suspended for failing a drug test. Following this, he would temporarily quit the company outright, as on the September 27th episode of Raw, Razor Ramon would end up being crowned the new champion after beating Rick Martel, with this starting a storyline that would climax in a very special match at the next year's WrestleMania, but we'll get there. In the meantime, WWF still had one big show to get through, and that would be November 24th Survivor Series where, this time, reverting back to the older formula, things would be made up mostly of multi-man elimination matches once again. But that's not to say there was nothing notable happening at the show as, in the opener, Diesel, the new hire who'd recently been brought in to act as the bodyguard of HBK, would make his in-ring debut in a match that saw him team with Erwin R. Shyster, Rick the Bottle Martel, and Adam Bomb to take on Razor Ramon, the 1-2-3 Kid, Marty Jannetty, and Mr. Perfect. Elsewhere, Bret Hart was supposed to continue his feud with Jerry Lawler in a match that saw the Hitman and his brothers Owen, Bruce, and Keith take on the King in his court. Prior to the event, however, Lawler would be pulled after charges were leveled against him, charges he would later be exonerated of. In the meantime, though, the WWF would be able to coax Shawn Michaels back into the company as he took the King's place, teaming with 3 masked men to take on the Harts in what marked his and Bret's second meeting at the Survivor Series. And while the babyfaces would reign victorious come the end of this one, Owen would end up getting eliminated, with him being the only member of his family to do so, something which caused him to get frustrated as his brothers celebrated then, ultimately teasing where the story of him and the Hitman was going. After that was done, a surprising bout would take place as, on a WWF pay-per-view, the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Tag Team Championships would be put on the line when the Heavenly Bodies took on the Rock and Roll Express. And while to a 1980s territory audience this may have felt like a big deal, to a WWF crowd in 1993 it unsurprisingly fell flat. So luckily, there was a bigger main event still to come, which would see Lex Luger, The Undertaker, and the Steiner brothers take on Yokozuna, Ludwig Borga, and the Quebecers. Yes, at this point, Vince McMahon still believed that Lex could be his next big star, but with WrestleMania still 4 months away, he would use this match to segue Yoko off into a temporary program with The Undertaker instead, as they battled to the back while the All-American Hero got the pinfall over Borga so as to win the bout. But victory or not, it was clear that fans were no longer behind Luger. No, they were still all in on their real hero Bret Hart, who would actually be challenged to a match by his brother Owen following the Survivor Series. Unwilling to fight his own flesh and blood, however, the Hitman would refuse this, something which only caused things to get worse between the siblings as time went on. And while that wouldn't climax until 1994, 93 still did have a couple more notable events, as on December 13th at an All-American Wrestling show, the WWF Women's title would be reactivated when Alundra Blaze defeated Heidi Lee Morgan to win the vacant title. In sadder news, though, that month would also see the final WWF appearance of Bobby Heenan during this era as, after the December 4th episode of Raw, he'd also leave the company to go join WCW. Yes, whether Vince knew it or not, the Monday Night Wars were beginning to heat up, and while that was percolating, the steroid trial was drawing even closer too. On top of that, he had a new top babyface that fans just weren't getting behind, something which wasn't helping the continued waning fan interest in the product overall. What changes would he make in 1994? We'll find out in our next episode, but suffice to say, it would ultimately be the year where a new generation finally took hold completely. The year 1994 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we were first introduced to Friends. In music, Nas released Illmatic, and in the WWF, we would see the rise of a new generation. Yes, the golden era of Hulkamania was well and truly dead by now, and in its wake, a new group of performers were taking over. But as 94 was also the year of the infamous steroid trial, it wasn't always clear if Vince McMahon's company would survive this change. So, how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1994, a year in review. When we last left off, Yokozuna was still the WWF champion, and there were two possible contenders to be the one to finally take him down. The boss's choice, Lex Luger, and the fans' choice, Bret Hart. Yes, to modern fans, this will be a situation that's all too familiar. The hand-picked top star versus the one audiences want to see in that role. Luckily though, at this point, with business down and his future unclear, McMahon was far more willing to listen to what others wanted, and so that was why, as the Royal Rumble rolled around on January 22nd, he would ask the paying crowd in attendance to hold an informal poll of sorts about who they wanted to see in the main event of WrestleMania that year. Before we would get there, though, the tag team titles would change hands on two separate occasions, with the Quebecers losing them to the 1-2-3 Kid and Marty Jannetty on the January 10th episode of Raw, and then winning them right back again 1 week later. And this would actually make Shawn Waltman, who was only 21 at the time, the youngest person to ever hold a WWF title at that point. At the Royal Rumble itself, however, the belts would stay around the Canadians' waists as they were able to defend against Bret and Owen Hart, with this match being the one where the older sibling would refuse to tag out after picking up a kayfabe leg injury, eventually forcing the referee to call a stoppage. After that then, Owen, who had already been frustrated with Bret prior to this, kicked his brother's leg out of his leg, turning heel in the process and starting one of the best rivalries in WWF history. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the card, Razor Ramon would be successfully defending the Intercontinental title against Erwin R. Shyster, and Yokozuna would beat The Undertaker in a casket match, the very same match that would end with the dead man being taken out by the entire heel locker room, then seemingly ascending to heaven after this was over, something which was done so as to write him off TV while he recovered from injury. But over in the main event, things would be far less decisive as, in the 30-man Battle Royal to determine the next #1 contender to the WWF title, while the likes of Bam Bam Bigelow, Crush, and Diesel would all put on impressive showings, in the end, it would come down to two, Lex Luger and the Hitman, the latter of whom had miraculously managed to make it back for the bout despite his prior injury. And as things were drawing to a close, both would actually eliminate each other at the same time, with this leading to a situation where each was named the winner, as fans were from there left wondering about who was going to WrestleMania. Either way though, their preference was clear, as when Luger's hand was raised by an official following this, the cheers were noticeable, but when Hart's hand was raised, the crowd exploded. So listening to this then, Vince McMahon decided he was going to go with Bret instead. But that would ultimately lead to an unusual world title picture at the Showcase of the Immortals as, with Lex holding an equal claim to the title, Yokozuna would have to defend against both on the same night. Before we would get there, though, the rest of the card would shape up, as Shawn Michaels would stake his claim to being the real Intercontinental Champion when he took out Razor Ramon in the weeks that followed, setting up a truly groundbreaking match in the process. As well as this, Owen Hart would continually demand a match with his brother, something which the Hitman would refuse to do at first for fear of tearing his family apart. Come the night of WrestleMania 10 on March 20th, however, in front of a packed Madison Square Garden crowd, he would cave in and give his younger sibling what he wanted as, from there, the two opened the show with one of the best bouts in WWF history. And by the end of that one, to the shock of many, it would actually be Owen who picked up the win, giving him bragging rights forever, and starting off Bret's night with a whimper, despite him still having a WWF title match to come. Elsewhere on the card, meanwhile, while Alundra Blaze was defending the women's title against Leilani Kai and the Quebecers were doing the same with their tag team titles against Men on a Mission, Macho Man Randy Savage would have his last ever WrestleMania victory when he beat Crush in a pretty terrible Falls Count Anywhere match. After that, Lex Luger would finally get his shot at Yokozuna as, with Mr. Perfect acting as the special guest referee, the two would battle it out over the WWF title in the middle of the show. Despite his best efforts though, by now it was clear to all that Lex's moment had passed, and so, after 14 minutes and 40 seconds, he would end up losing by disqualification, closing the book on his main event run right there. But someone else's main event run was just getting started that night, as in the second-to-last bout, Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon would go to war over the Intercontinental title in a ladder match, with this marking the first time on television WWF had ever put on such a contest. So, wowed by what they were seeing then, fans couldn't look away as, over the next 18 minutes, HBK and Razor put on the second classic of the night, a match so good that it would later be the first WWF bout to ever be awarded 5 stars by Dave Meltzer. And while Ramon would be the winner come the end of this, it would be Shawn who really saw his stock rise afterwards as his performance that night caused him to quickly become one of the most popular WWF stars on the roster. But there was still one more match to come before the show could end, and that was the main event between Bret Hart and Yokozuna, where in a rematch from the year before, the WWF title would once again be on the line. This time though, there was no Hulk Hogan to throw things off track, and so that was why, after just over 10 minutes, the Hitman was able to pin the heel champion to win the title for the second time as, from there, the babyface roster came out to the ring to hoist him up on their shoulders in celebration. Out in the entranceway though, one person who wouldn't be celebrating was Owen Hart, as he would instead watch with a mixture of frustration and glee, angry that his brother had once again stolen his moment, but happy in the knowledge that his earlier victory over him placed him next in line for a title shot. So following on from WrestleMania then, the Harts would start a lengthy feud, one which threatened to tear their family apart at the seams. And while this was happening, Vince McMahon's woes would grow and grow, as he would find himself in court, being forced to defend himself on charges of supplying anabolic steroids to members of his roster. And while, given the size of his roster in the years prior, it seemed clear that there was rampant drug use going on, the prosecution were having difficulty proving that McMahon was directly involved in this, something which led things to go down to the wire as, come June, fearing that he was going to go to prison, the boss would make plans to hand off day-to-day booking of his company to Jerry Jarrett, hoping then that he wouldn't have to serve too long behind bars and would be able to return before long. And if that wasn't bad enough, McMahon would find himself in court twice more this year. Once when he was forced to pay a settlement of $26.7 million to Charles Austin, a journeyman wrestler who had nearly been paralyzed during a botched rocker dropper, and again when Jesse the Body Ventura successfully sued him for $800,000 of unpaid royalties. Then, to top it all off, on June 10th, Hulk Hogan, who upon leaving WWF said he would never compete with Vince, signed on the dotted line with World Championship Wrestling, giving them the boost they needed to become legitimate competition to WWF in the years that followed. Yes, things weren't going well at all behind the scenes, but at least on camera, the company was able to put on a brave face as, that same month, they would induct their second Hall of Fame class, with this one including legends such as Bobo Brazil, Chief Jay Strongbow, Gorilla Monsoon, Classy Freddie Blassie, and the first ever WWF champion, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. On top of that, titles would change hands like wildfire as, in the weeks and months prior, Men on a Mission would have won and then lost the tag team titles, leaving the Head Shrinkers to pick them up for themselves in April, all while elsewhere, Diesel had started his rise to the top by beating Razor Ramon for the Intercontinental title on an episode of Superstars that same month. And this all led to the King of the Ring on June 19th, where hoping to prove that he was just as good as his brother in every way, Owen Hart had made it his intention to win the same crown Bret had won the prior year. As that was going on though, the Hitman once again found himself having to face off against a standing Intercontinental champion when he got into a feud with Diesel, with this seeing the up-and-comer face the next test on his rapid ascent towards the top. But before that match would happen, the commentary team for the night would get things going by calling the quarterfinals of the titular tournament, with this round seeing Owen Hart, Razor Ramon, Irwin R. Shyster, and the 1-2-3 Kid all advancing. But by the time this was over, audiences watching at home were less focused on the matches themselves and more on the absolute terrible commentary of Art Donovan, with him repeatedly asking his co-announcers Gorilla Monsoon and Randy Savage who the wrestlers were and how much does this guy weigh as the night went on. But why he was there and not Vince McMahon? Well, that's because McMahon was allegedly suffering from a neck injury at this point, something which many believed was being done so he could go back to court to receive the jury's decision with a sympathetic neck brace on less than a week later. And so, with him gone for the night, Monsoon and Savage were forced to try and keep the train on track as, while the Head Shrinkers were retaining their tag team titles against Yokozuna and Crush, Diesel would shock the world when he beat Bret Hart. And while this would be a disqualification win, meaning the title didn't change hands, it still went a long way towards showing the high hopes the company had in Kevin Nash going forward. Back in the King of the Ring tournament though, the semifinals would see Razor Ramon beat IRS and Owen Hart take out the 1-2-3 Kid in probably the best 3-minute match you're ever likely to see. And after that, the final would pit these two winners against each other, with Owen able to stay true to his promise by the end when he did exactly what his brother had done the year prior, winning the King of the Ring, and from there, dubbing himself to be the King of Hearts. But that wasn't the main event of the night as it happened because, in a baffling decision for a show which was the first to officially feature the label The New Generation, the last bout of the night would see 40-year-old Rowdy Roddy Piper take on 44-year-old Jerry the King Lawler in a match no one was clamoring to see. Luckily then, this only went on for 12 minutes and saw Piper come out the victor by the end, with him disappearing from WWF TV once again from there as Lawler returned to the commentary booth. More importantly than this though, it would be 6 days later when Vince McMahon's fate was decided as, in the wrestling trial of the century, he was ultimately found not guilty on account of a lack of solid evidence that he had personally distributed steroids to his performers. That said, even if he was a free man, both his and his company's reputation had taken a massive hit as it was clear that drugs had been rampant for years, and many still believed that the boss was up to his elbows in the whole thing. So having to try and move away from this image, WWF would be forced to clamp down and fire anyone who was caught with anabolic steroids after this, something which actually led to Crush being fired the following year. On top of this, McMahon would institute a testing policy for all his performers going forward, which they were expected to adhere to, though this would fade away in importance as the heat gradually began to die down. Back in the ring, meanwhile, WWF's next big show of the year would take place on August 29th as, there in front of a packed Chicago crowd, SummerSlam would take place. And this would end up being a show filled with ups and downs as the newly exonerated boss continued to struggle with defining the new identity of his company. Sure, he wanted to push more natural-looking, athletic guys in the wake of the steroid trial, and Bret Hart was the most over guy on the roster. But still, he couldn't quite get over his fixation with big muscle men, and so this would lead to the Hitman not main eventing that night, despite the fact that he was the incoming world champion and a part of the hottest feud in the company. No, that honor would instead go to the returning Undertaker. Yes, after having taken 7 months off and missing WrestleMania, the Phenom was now ready to return to the ring. But as he had been killed off prior to this, WWF would reintroduce him by having Naked Gun star Leslie Nielsen play his trademark dithering cop in a series of skits during the lead-up to the big show, interviewing various members of the public who claimed to have seen The Undertaker, thus proving he was still alive. And this would be made even more interesting when, in early August, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, the very same man who had initially brought the dead man into the company, claimed to have reacquired his services going forward. That then would see him bring The Undertaker back in the weeks that followed, only for Paul Bearer to then return himself and announce that this incarnation of the fan favorite was nothing more than an imposter, and that the real Phenom would be coming with him to SummerSlam to send the Pretender packing. Elsewhere, in the lead-up to the big show, the Hart family feud would continue to get even worse when, still demanding his title shot, Owen would chase Bret around the house show circuit, at one point even picking up a phantom title win over him and becoming, for a couple of minutes at least, the WWF champion. And so, after so many battles and with other family members such as Jim the Anvil Neidhart constantly getting involved, it became clear that the only way to settle things once and for all would be at the upcoming SummerSlam show, where the two agreed to face off once more for the title inside of a steel cage. So that was how we came to the biggest show of the summer on August 29th, with the two main events set up as big-time matches that would surely blow fans away. Meanwhile, on the undercard, Alundra Blaze would once again defend the WWF Women's title, this time against Bull Nakano, all while Tatanka was picking up a victory over the now mid-card Lex Luger, and in the Click segment of the show, Razor Ramon was winning back the IC title from Diesel. After that, the cage would be constructed and the Hart brothers would each enter, with them from there putting on arguably the greatest cage match of all time as, over the next 32 minutes, they had their second classic of the year and told a story that made complete sense throughout, with each constantly trying to escape and pick up the win. And this one would be so good that it actually ended up marking the second time Dave Meltzer would award a Fed match 5 stars that year. Come the finish though, it would be Bret who would get the victory, retaining his title and seemingly putting the feud to bed. So with only one match left, expectations were high for the Undertaker vs. Undertaker match to live up to the Hart's showdown. Sadly, however, with Brian Lee playing the role of the fake Phenom and this still being the period before Mark Calloway was putting on great bouts routinely, the whole thing pretty much stunk up the joint, killing the crowd stone dead in the process. Thankfully then, it only lasted 9 minutes, and once it was over, the real dead man stood tall once more, re-establishing himself as the top guy in the company. Sure, it would have probably been a better idea to main event with Bret instead and make his title reign seem more important, but by this point, it was clear that Vince McMahon was once again losing faith in the Canadian, with him already having chosen someone new to replace him. Before that would happen though, at a house show on August 28th, the Click's influence would continue to grow, as Shawn Michaels and Diesel defeated the Head Shrinkers to become tag team champions. As well as that, Randy Savage would make his exit from WWF, with his last appearance coming on the October 31st episode of Raw, as he, from there, followed Hulk Hogan over to WCW. And the week following this, McMahon would even give a heartfelt goodbye to the Macho Man on the air, with this being the last time he would ever mention him again, as he later found himself being blackballed for reasons that still remain unclear up until this day. Then, as if all that wasn't enough, on November 20th at an All-Japan Women's Pro Wrestling show in Tokyo, Bull Nakano would pin Alundra Blaze to become the WWF Women's Champion for the first time in her career. So, heading into Survivor Series, the final pay-per-view of the year on November 23rd, it seemed like anything could happen. And while the show was largely filled up with inconsequential 5-on-5 elimination matches once again, the most notable of which saw Shawn Michaels and Diesel finally split up after the latter had turned babyface, in the end, something big did change, as in the WWF title match, Bret Hart would face off against Bob Backlund, former champion and face of the company himself, and someone who had since returned to WWF with the intention of whipping the younger generation into shape. Still, despite his legit fighting credentials, no one expected him to beat the Hitman that night during their submission match. That was why it came as such a shock then, when after locking the champion in a seemingly endless cross-faced chicken wing towards the end of the bout, Owen Hart would get his final revenge when he threw in the towel for his brother, costing him both the match and the title in the process. Yes, it was a moment that no one saw coming and an unfortunate limp end to Bret's second reign, but things weren't done there as it happened, because after that, in the main event, The Undertaker would finally get revenge against the man who put him out of action for so many months when he defeated Yokozuna in a casket match, albeit this time with a little help from living meme Chuck Norris. And from there, with his weight continuing to be an issue, Yoko would begin to be phased down the card, something which must have come as a relief to the new champion, Bob Backlund. What he didn't realize, though, was that his title reign would be short-lived anyway, as at a live event in Madison Square Garden just 3 days later, he would be convincingly beaten by Diesel in just 8 seconds, as from there, Big Daddy Cool started his reign as the new face of the company. Yes, it looked like in finding a new big man he could get behind, one who was free of steroids, Vince McMahon had decided to throw the Hitman aside once again and fall back into his old familiar patterns of muscular, tall performers once more. And while that decision would prove to be a short-sighted one in the end, he wouldn't realize that until the following year, a year which would prove to be arguably the worst in the company's history. But that's another story for another day, because this would mark the end of 1994. The year where, despite WWE's future feeling at its most unsure behind the scenes, on screen they would put on at least 3 matches that can still stand to this day as being among the best ever. And the fact that they all included Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels was a sign of things to come in the near future. The year 1995 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we were first introduced to Goosebumps. In sports, Michael Jordan would return to the court, and in the world of wrestling, WCW were formally lighting the fires of the Monday Night Wars by debuting their weekly primetime show, Nitro. However, when it came to the WWF, there were very few positives to be found as, over the next 12 months, they would go through arguably their worst year ever. Yes, the WWF in '95 has become notorious amongst longtime fans as being terrible. However, that's not to say it's not without its charm, with some of the wackiest gimmicks in wrestling history being introduced at this time. So, how did it all unfold? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1995, a year in review. Of course, when we last left off, things were looking positive. Diesel had just been crowned the new WWF champion, and Shawn Michaels' rise to the top of the main event scene was continuing at a fast pace. That said, there were also a lot of negatives as, despite overwhelming audience support for his work, Bret Hart seemed to have been dropped from his position as the company's top babyface, something which left a sour taste in many fans' mouths. And this negativity would only grow when, at the first big show of the year on January 22nd, the Royal Rumble, WWF would put on one of the weakest Rumble matches up until that point, with them making the odd decision here to have a new entrant come in every 1 minute instead of 2, leading to the whole thing being over before it felt like it had gotten started. But before we would get here, the undercard would see Razor Ramon losing his Intercontinental title to Jeff Jarrett, and The Undertaker continue his seemingly endless feud with Ted DiBiase when he was able to make short work of his $1 Million Corporation lackey, Irwin R. Shyster. After that, however, things would get more interesting as, in the finals of a tournament to crown new WWF Tag Team Champions after Diesel and Shawn Michaels' split had left the belts vacant, Bob Holly and the 1-2-3 Kid would team up to take on Bam Bam Bigelow and Tatanka, with the former duo ending up getting the win here to crown themselves the new top team in the company. And after the match, Bam Bam would find himself being mocked by former New York Giants star Lawrence Taylor, something which led to the Beast from the East losing his cool and trying to get into a kayfabe shoving match with a celebrity guest. But WWF officials were quick to calm things down and move on from there, as the first of 2 main events would see Diesel defend his newly won WWF title against the man who had been screwed out of it in the first place, Bret Hart. That said, this was no redemption story for the Hitman because, on this night, his role was to put the new champion over strong, something he did in typical professional fashion, even if it was already clear amongst a section of the fan base that they'd rather see him still on top. So it was lucky then that the fans would get something they wanted in the final bout of the night, because in the Royal Rumble itself, Shawn Michaels and the British Bulldog would enter at numbers 1 and 2 respectively, with each going coast to coast from there as they powered through one of the worst Rumbles in memory, only to end up being the final 2 remaining after everyone else was eliminated. After that, it appeared that the Bulldog had managed to eliminate HBK, but with only one foot having hit the floor, the Texan was able to get back in the ring to dump out his opponent, winning the whole thing and booking his ticket to WrestleMania 11 as another celebrity guest, Pamela Anderson, was there to celebrate by his side. Yes, it seemed like the long-awaited showdown between Shawn and Diesel was going to happen at the biggest stage possible. But before we would get there, the tag titles would change hands once more when, the night after the Rumble on Raw, the Smoking Guns would defeat Bob Holly and the 1-2-3 Kid to end their reign after just one day. And come WrestleMania on April 3rd, they'd still be holding these belts as they tried their best to give some wrestling focus to a show that was almost entirely built around celebrity involvement. Of course, celebs at the biggest show of the year was nothing new for WWF, as they'd originally built it on the backs of people like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper. This year, though, it felt like, with such little confidence in the roster he had, Vince McMahon was putting every ounce of attention he had to the outside stars he'd brought in instead, to the point where it became a detriment to the show. Yes, this was one that could challenge WrestleMania 9 for the position of worst Mania ever, with the undercard seeing Razor Ramon regain his Intercontinental title from Jeff Jarrett in a pretty nothing match, Owen Hart and Yokozuna team for the first time to win the tag titles from the Smoking Guns, and The Undertaker go 4-0 after beating another Ted DiBiase lackey in King Kong Bundy. Following this, Bret Hart would have arguably the worst match of his career when he faced off against Bob Backlund again in a submission match. Unlike their prior meeting at the 1994 Survivor Series, however, this one was marred by a scenery-chewing Roddy Piper acting as the special guest referee, leading the whole thing to quickly fall apart and stink out the joint. Then, not main eventing the show, Diesel, with Pamela Anderson by his side, would successfully defend his WWF title against Shawn Michaels, who himself would come to the ring with Jenny McCarthy. And after putting on such an impressive performance during this match, HBK would end up completely overshadowing the champion, effectively turning himself babyface, and the reason he hadn't main evented that night was because, instead, Vince McMahon had chosen to go with Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow, a move that was supposed to draw a lot of mainstream attention, but ended up doing little to help the lack of interest in his product and only served to undermine the importance of the show, especially after the football star would have defeated Bam Bam come the end of it. So with his plan to gain mainstream eyeballs failing, the boss would try something else, as on May 14th, he would put on the first ever In Your House show, a lower-priced pay-per-view offering that was supposed to act as a buffer in between the bigger shows of the year. And this inaugural edition would see Bret Hart continue to prove that he was the best in the world when he had a hugely underrated match with Hakushi, all before later that night continuing his feud with Jerry Lawler when he ultimately lost to the King once again. After that, Owen Hart and Yokozuna would once again defend their tag team titles against the Smoking Guns, while in the main event of the night, Diesel would fend off his first challenger in the form of a recently returned Psycho Sid, and things wouldn't get much better the next month at the King of the Ring as, after holding their now annual Hall of Fame the night prior, one which saw the likes of Pedro Morales, Big Cat Ernie Ladd, George the Animal Steele, and the Fabulous Moolah be inducted, WWF would put on one of the worst pay-per-views of all time when, in front of a very vocal Philadelphia crowd, Bret Hart would work a pretty awful Kiss My Foot match against Jerry Lawler, all while the main event would see Diesel and Bam Bam Bigelow defeat Psycho Sid and Tatanka in a bout no one could have cared about if they'd tried. But that wasn't even the worst part of the night as, after going through The Undertaker in a prior round, Mabel would defeat Savio Vega to become the King of the Ring in a decision that was wildly rejected by the fans in attendance, most of whom took to chanting for ECW instead as the new king was being crowned. So you'd think that, hearing the reaction to this, Vince McMahon would have made some changes, but no, he would push on with his planned SummerSlam main event of Diesel versus Mabel regardless, a match no one wanted to see. Before that though, In Your House 2, The Lumberjacks would be held on July 23rd, and that would see the final appearances of Jeff Jarrett and the Roadie during the period as, after the former lost his Intercontinental title to Shawn Michaels and the latter picked up a win over the 1-2-3 Kid, they would each quit the company following a contract dispute, putting a stopper on the planned feud between the two going forward. Elsewhere, the boss would continue to build Mabel as a top challenger by having Men on a Mission defeat Razor Ramon and Savio Vega in a tag team match, all while, in the main event of the night, Diesel was defending the WWF title against Psycho Sid in a lumberjack match. And that would all ultimately lead us to SummerSlam on August 27th, where in an attempt to put on a show that would bring audiences back into the fold, Vince McMahon had almost every title be on the line, as Alundra Blaze, who had won the women's strap back from Bull Nakano on the April 3rd episode of Raw, would defend against Bertha Faye, ultimately falling to her here as a new champion was crowned. Following this, two notable newcomers would be introduced to pay-per-view audiences, as Hunter Hearst Helmsley would defeat Bob Holly, and Sunny would accompany her man Skip to the ring as he went on to lose to Barry Horowitz. Meanwhile, The Undertaker's feud with the Million Dollar Corporation would continue when he faced off against Kama in a casket match, the very same man who had stolen his mystical urn following WrestleMania 11 and had supposedly then melted it down to form a gold chain, which he took to wearing around his neck. Yes, it was a pretty bad story, and unluckily for fans, the match wouldn't fare much better, as despite their best efforts, the two wouldn't be able to do anything with the gimmick, leaving the Dead Man to mercifully end both the bout and the feud as a whole with a victory after just over 16 minutes. After that, things would get even worse when Bret Hart continued his program with Jerry Lawler by taking on the King's personal dentist, Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS, an early gimmick for Glenn Jacobs that's best left forgotten. So thank God then that the Clique would put something worth watching next, as in the semi-main event, Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon would replay their ladder match from WrestleMania 10, this time putting on yet another classic as, come the end of it, it would be HBK who came out on top, solidifying himself once more as Intercontinental Champion in the process. Unfortunately though, the main event wouldn't be able to match up to this, as there, Diesel would successfully defend against Mabel in one of the worst bouts in WWF history, a meeting so bad that it almost left the champion injured for real after the challenger dropped himself full force on his back. And this almost led to him getting fired after things were done, in fact, with Diesel ending up having to talk Vince McMahon out of doing this in the end. But if the boss thought this would be the only headache he had to deal with at this time, he was very wrong, as only a week after this, on September 4th, WCW would debut Monday Nitro, their weekly answer to Raw that aired live on TNT. And in a move that would set the tone for what was to come, on that very debut episode of Nitro, Lex Luger, who had been under WWF contract until days before, would jump ship, something which no one inside of Vince McMahon's inner circle knew was coming ahead of time. And to make matters worse, back in the WWF, the boss was having to deal with not only a series of terrible failed gimmicks such as Mantar, Fantasio, and Techno Team 2000, but also the increasing problem of the Clique, as, with Triple H now having made his way to the company, he would become the fifth and final member of the backstage power group that also included Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon, and the 1-2-3 Kid. So from there, with their ranks now full, the Clique would make life a living hell for anyone they didn't like, seeming to be the real ones in charge at various points as Vince struggled to corral his top stars into doing what he wanted. But try as he might, they always seemed to get what their hearts desired, something that would become apparent on screen at the next big show of the year, In Your House 3, triple header on September 24th. Yes, it was there that the company promised that every male title the company had would be on the line in the same match, as the tag team champions Owen Hart and Yokozuna took on the newly reformed HBK and Diesel, with them still holding the Intercontinental and World titles respectively. And during that match, two dudes with attitude, as they would become known, would end up getting the win, seemingly taking all the gold home for themselves in that moment. Elsewhere, meanwhile, in a series of nothing bouts, the rest of the card would see Bret Hart continue to dwell in the upper mid-card as he picked up a submission win over Jean-Pierre Lafitte, a feud which had started after the French-Canadian heel stole the Hitman's jacket. On top of this, Dean Douglas would defeat Razor Ramon, the British Bulldog would pick up a win over Bam Bam Bigelow, and Psycho Sid would reign victorious over Henry O. Godwin in a sign that, despite their desire to put on more pay-per-views every year, WWF hadn't quite figured out how to build enough big-time matches so as to accommodate for this. But at least fans had seen a big title change. Well, that's what they thought at least, up until it was revealed that, the next night on Raw, due to a controversial finish that saw the legal man not be pinned in the end, the whole result was to be thrown out and everyone would keep their belts going forward, something which left the audience who'd pay for the show feeling shortchanged. And it wasn't as if the company had any plans for Owen and Yokozuna going forward anyway, because later that same night on Raw, they'd drop the titles to the Smoking Guns as Billy and Bart started their own reign on top. So maybe the next pay-per-view, In Your House 4 Great White North, held on October 22nd, would fare better. Well, fans certainly hoped for this to be the case ahead of time, it would ultimately be even less well received as, in the main event of the night, Diesel and the British Bulldog would have a match so bad that it would finally force Vince McMahon to realize the whole Kevin Nash experiment wasn't working, and so make plans to go with someone new on top instead. And prior to this, things wouldn't be much better as, in a largely irrelevant undercard, the Smoking Guns would defend their tag team titles they recently won from Owen Hart and Yokozuna against Razor Ramon and the 1-2-3 Kid, all while Hunter Hearst Helmsley was picking up a win over Fatu, Goldust was defeating Marty Jannetty, and King Mabel and Yokozuna went to a double countout. In fact, aside from the main event, the only other thing of relevance that would come from the show at all would be Razor Ramon pulling double duty to end the very brief Intercontinental title reign of Dean Douglas. But wait, wasn't Shawn Michaels the Intercontinental Champion? Well, yes, but after getting into a bar fight with a number of Marines in the weeks leading up to the show, he'd end up getting hurt bad enough to where he wouldn't be cleared to wrestle for a while, allowing him to drop the strap without actually being pinned. And this method of losing titles would be a repeating pattern for HBK over the next couple of years as it happened, something which would cause his boss no end of headaches. Still, so talented was he that McMahon had by then decided he should be his next top star anyway, with him from there beginning to make plans to have him achieve his boyhood dream at the next year's WrestleMania. Before we would get there though, Alundra Blaze would win back the women's title from Bertha Faye the next night on Raw. Then, following this, Survivor Series would come on November 19th, with that show once again largely being made up of a number of 4-on-4 elimination matches, none of which really held any importance in the grand scheme of things. No, the only real notable bout of this show was the main event one, as it was there that Bret Hart would challenge Diesel for the WWF title, taking Big Daddy Cool to his limits and finally giving him a great match he could hang his hat on. Come the end of the day, though, it would be the Hitman who would pick up the win, putting the run of Kevin Nash to bed and starting his third reign on top as WWF champion. But this wasn't a sign that Vince McMahon had decided to go with Bret again, as he'd end up acting as a transitional champion instead, keeping the belt warm until next spring when the man who would go on to become a bitter enemy, both on screen and in real life, would finally get the better of him. And aside from Bret's big win, the other notable thing that came out of the match was Diesel's soft heel turn following his loss, something which instantly gave him back some of the cool factor he'd originally had as he became the first person to flip someone off on WWF TV. Yes, maybe if the boss had allowed him to be this person during his reign and not try to turn him into a budget Hulk Hogan, things would have been much different. But that couldn't be changed now, and so the company pressed on as they prepared for their final pay-per-view of the year. Before this would happen though, Alundra Blaze would shock the wrestling world when she followed Lex Luger in jumping ship to WCW on December 13th. What made her defection different though was that, when she did this, she was still in possession of the WWF Women's title, leading her to take it with her and actually dump it in the trash live on Nitro. Yes, this was certainly a black eye for Vince McMahon and a sign that his competition was gaining more and more momentum, something that would get worse over the next 12 months. So in retaliation, he'd choose to deactivate the belt entirely, leaving the company without a real women's division for the next few years. And after that, it was full steam ahead for In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings on December 17th where, while Razor Ramon was dealing with the recent betrayal he'd undergone from the 1-2-3 Kid in a tag match that saw the former team with Marty Jannetty and the latter team with Psycho Sid, their clique buddy Hunter Hearst Helmsley would continue his rise up the ranks with a win over Henry O. Godwin in an Arkansas hog pen match. Elsewhere, Jerry Lawler would welcome Jeff Jarrett back to the company after presenting him with a kayfabe gold record for all his supposed album sales, and after that, the villainous Santa Claus would make his debut by laying out Savio Vega. Yes, it was a stupid gimmick amongst an era that would have many of them, but at least the main event scene didn't have to worry about this, as in the WWF title match later that night, Bret Hart would successfully defend his newly won belt against the British Bulldog in a rematch from their famous bout at Wembley Stadium 3 years prior. And while this one wouldn't be on that level, it would prove to be a step up in match quality from Diesel's run as champ as Bret continued to excellently execute on a nightly basis. So being able to end 1995 with a slight bit of upward momentum must have felt like a win for the WWF then, especially given how rough of a year it had been. But as it happened, there was one more notable thing that took place this month, one that, while no one realized it at the time, would have major implications for the company's future. Yes, on December 18th, an episode of Raw was taped, and while this episode wouldn't air on TV until the following January, it let the live crowd get introduced to a new signing, the Ringmaster, the very man who would later morph into Stone Cold Steve Austin and carry the company towards unforeseen levels of success. But we'll get there in a couple of years. That's right, even if it had been a pretty terrible year for WWF both creatively and financially, arguably the worst in their entire history in fact, their future was ultimately secure. Before they would be able to stabilize fully though, 1996 would see some more rough times ahead, as with the Monday Night Wars continuing to get more and more intense every week, the backstage problems that Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels started to have with each other, and another exodus of top talent still to come, Vince McMahon's headaches would be far from over. Ultimately though, that's a story for another day. The year 1996 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of film, we were first introduced to Scream. In music, Jay-Z released his debut album Reasonable Doubt, and in the WWF, we'd see the rise of Austin 3:16. Yes, it was a pivotal year in the wrestling world, as it would be the period that saw the Monday Night Wars really get started, as while some key figures would leave WWF, others would begin to rise in their place. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1996, a year in review. When we last left off, Vince McMahon had finally decided to throw in the towel on the Diesel experiment, instead temporarily reverting back to Bret Hart until he could get his next big star ready to be crowned at WrestleMania. Before we would get there, though, the first big show of the year, the Royal Rumble, would take place on January 26th with a card that featured the Hitman defending the WWF title against The Undertaker, all while in the undercard, the Smoking Guns would retain the tag straps against the Body Donnas, and Goldust would defeat Razor Ramon to become the Intercontinental Champion. Over in the most anticipated bout of the night, meanwhile, the Rumble itself would feature a number of big names including Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Vader, and a new recruit into the company, the Ringmaster. Yes, played by WCW's stunning Steve Austin, the Ringmaster had been brought in as Ted DiBiase's new client, with the legend even going as far as to bestow upon him his old $1 million championship going forward. But that wouldn't be enough to get him the win on this night as, for the second year running, it would be Shawn Michaels who picked up the victory come the end, booking himself a spot in the main event of WrestleMania once again, this time against Bret Hart. That said, there would be complications along the way as, after having suffered a real-life beating at the hands of a group of Marines the year prior, HBK would use this to start a storyline which saw him suffer some long-term effects, something which had been highlighted the prior November when he kayfabe collapsed in the middle of the ring during a bout with Owen Hart, a moment Hart would later take credit for causing. So this would eventually lead to the two going one-on-one at February 8th's In Your House 6 Rage in the Cage, where putting his #1 contendership spot on the line, HBK would be able to reign tall and continue on the path towards achieving his boyhood dream. Elsewhere, the rest of the card would see the Click rule as Hunter Hearst Helmsley defeated Duke the Dumpster Droese and Razor Ramon defeated the 1-2-3 Kid. After that, though, the main event featured the rematch between the Hitman and Diesel, with things this time being held inside of a steel cage. The cage, however, would not be able to stop The Undertaker, as at the close of the bout, he'd burst out from under the ring to pull Diesel down to the depths of hell, allowing Bret to get the win. And this was done so as to set up a match between the two big men at WrestleMania the following month, with initial plans allegedly being for Big Daddy Cool to get the win here. Before that would happen though, both he and Razor Ramon would give their notice to leave the company as, frustrated with the lack of money they were making during WWF's leanest time financially, they decided that the grass would be greener over in WCW, where Eric Bischoff had promised them both huge contracts. And obviously upset about this, Vince McMahon would pull Razor from his planned match with Goldust at the Showcase of the Immortals, instead replacing him with Rowdy Roddy Piper, as the two went on to have a very memorable Hollywood backlot brawl that offered more than a passing nod to the O.J. Simpson police chase of the year before, and eventually saw Piper come out on top in the end. Elsewhere on the card of WrestleMania 12, though, the Boss would not replace Diesel from his match with The Undertaker, as this had already been promoted on TV. That said, he would change the finish, allowing the Dead Man to take his streak to 5-0, saving a major future storyline that no one realized was a thing yet. But that wasn't all that was happening, as, elsewhere, the Body Donnas would win a tournament to crown themselves the new tag team champions after those belts had been vacated following an injury picked up by Billy Gunn. On top of this, Steve Austin, who had by then already dropped the Ringmaster gimmick and had morphed into a colder-blooded Stone Cold gimmick, would have his first great WrestleMania match when he defeated Savio Vega, all while the Ultimate Warrior would make yet another return to the company when he beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley in less than 2 minutes. Over in the main event, however, there would not be so quick an end as, in a 60-minute Iron Man match, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels would go the distance, battling it out to the point of exhaustion in a bout that, depending on who you ask, can be considered either the greatest wrestling match ever or the most overrated. And after an hour of neither man being able to score a fall, it would end up going down to sudden death, with HBK hitting his opponent with 2 super kicks at this point to finally achieve his boyhood dream and become WWF champion. But after the match, heat would begin to build when the new champion allegedly instructed Hart to get out of his ring so that he could have his moment. And this, while only a small moment at the time, would eventually snowball into a much bigger real-life beef between the two, which would go on to define the company's next couple of years. That would remain on the back burner for now though, as, taking a much-needed break from the ring, the Hitman would disappear for the next 10 months, trying his hand out at acting, all while the new champion would establish himself in his absence. And this really began at April 28th's In Your House 6 Good Friends, Better Enemies, where, in a show that featured an undercard of mostly trivial matches, the main event would see Shawn and Diesel go one-on-one for the final time as they battled it out over the WWF title in a no-holds-barred match. And after putting his friend over strong here, Kevin Nash would begin to make final plans for his exit as, at a house show in Madison Square Garden, he, Razor Ramon, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and Shawn Michaels would all break kayfabe when they embraced each other in the middle of the ring, offering the fans a look at the Clique's final farewell, but also infuriating a lot of people behind the scenes in the process. So needing to enact some kind of punishment, Vince McMahon would begin working on a way to deal with the situation. But this was easier said than done, as with Hall and Nash now both gone to WCW and HBK pretty much bulletproof as the world champion, the sword instead had to fall on Helmsley as, taking the heat for the rest of his friends, he'd spend the next year in the doghouse, even having his planned King of the Ring win later that year cancelled. And things would start to get tougher for WWF as a whole then, too, as with the 2 exiting Clique members jumping over to WCW and starting the NWO storyline, the Southern Wrestling promotion suddenly looked like the far cooler product and, as such, almost immediately began overtaking McMahon's promotion in the ratings. But if the boss thought his next pay-per-view, In Your House 8 Beware of Dog on May 26th would help things, he was very wrong, as on that night, a massive power outage would cause the show to have to be stopped midway through, with the rest of the card being rescheduled for 2 days later instead. And it wasn't as if the card was anything to write home about anyway, as despite Shawn Michaels defending the WWF title against the British Bulldog and the Smoking Guns regaining their tag team titles, the only really noteworthy bout would be Steve Austin and Savio Vega's Caribbean strap match. So perhaps it was this that made McMahon realize that Austin had the potential to be more than a mid-carder, as the following month he would pick him to replace Triple H in becoming the King of the Ring. Before we would get there, though, WWF would take a trip over to the Middle East to do a special live tour, with the highlights of this being Ahmed Johnson winning the Kuwait Cup and Bret Hart even returning briefly to make an appearance. Once they were back stateside, however, it would be full steam ahead with the King of the Ring where, just 1 week after WCW had shaken the wrestling world to its core by having Hulk Hogan turn heel and join the NWO, WWF would have its own history-making moment, when after defeating both Mark Merrow and Jake Roberts to win the tournament, Steve Austin would go up the entrance ramp and cut a promo on the fly that has since been remembered as arguably the most important in the industry's history. Yes, this was the famous Austin 316 promo, and immediately it would turn Stone Cold into the coolest figure in the company, all this despite the fact that he was still supposed to be a heel. Elsewhere, the rest of the card would see a recently debuted Mankind get a shock win over The Undertaker, and the Ultimate Warrior defeat Jerry Lawler in what turned out to be the last big match of the former's run before he was once again fired for no-showing events. And after that, in the main event, Shawn Michaels would successfully defend his WWF title against the British Bulldog in a match that left few excited. Yes, for as great as HBK was, the reality remained that, as a champion, he just wasn't drawing, something which admittedly wasn't helped by the fact that WCW were, by some distance, the show to watch by then. And things wouldn't fare much better for Shawn at the next month's pay-per-view, In Your House 9 International Incident, as there he'd be stuck in a pretty throwaway six-man tag match that saw him team up with Psycho Sid and Ahmed Johnson to take on the British Bulldog, Owen Hart, and the new monster on the block, Vader. And so dominant was the Mastodon during this that, by the end of the bout, he'd be the one who'd get the win, booking him a shot at HBK at the following month's SummerSlam. So when that event came on August 18th, then, the champion knew he was in for his biggest challenge yet. And as it happened, the original booking plans were supposed to see Vader win this one, all until Shawn was able to use his backstage sway to get this decision changed at the last minute. Yes, by now, Michaels was gaining a reputation for being impossible to work with behind the scenes, something which was even made worse by his ever-growing drug problem. And that was how, after technically winning twice, once by disqualification and once by countout, Vader would end up losing that night as the champ's reign continued. That said, the biggest shocker of the night came before this when, in a boiler room brawl, Mankind would once again defeat The Undertaker after Paul Bearer turned on the dead man, laying him out with his own urn and aligning himself with Mick Foley's demented creation from there on in. But wait! Where was the fastest rising star in the industry, Steve Austin, on this card? Well, despite what revisionist history may have you believe, Stone Cold did not rocket to the main event right after winning the King of the Ring. Sure, his popularity with fans as an anti-hero would grow and grow over these months, but in terms of his booking, well, that was far slower to catch up as, on this event, he'd be relegated to a pre-show match with Yokozuna. And he wouldn't fare much better at September 22nd's In Your House 10 Mind Games, as on that night, he wouldn't even be on the card, instead having to watch from the sidelines as Owen Hart and the British Bulldog defeated the Smoking Guns to win the tag titles, a recently debuted Mark Henry picked up a victory over Jerry Lawler, and Shawn Michaels went to a no contest with Mankind in one of the most underrated matches in WWF history, about so good that for many years thereafter, Mick Foley would consider it to be his best. Yes, it was finally the great title defense HBK needed, but as for the Intercontinental title, well, that would have a far rougher period as, after being laid out and kayfabe injured by a debuting Farouk, Ahmed Johnson would be forced to vacate the IC belt. And this led to a tournament being held to crown a new champion then, one which would climax on the September 23rd episode of Raw when Mark Merrow was able to defeat Ron Simmons' newest gimmick. After that, the next big show of the year, In Your House 11 Buried Alive, would take place on October 20th and would see Owen Hart and the British Bulldog successfully defend their tag team titles against the Smoking Guns, Psycho Sid defeat Vader to earn a future shot at the WWF title, Shawn Michaels defeat Goldust in a dark match, and Steve Austin finally getting something to sink his teeth into when he picked up a win over Hunter Hearst Helmsley, all while debuting his now iconic glass-smashing theme music in the process. Elsewhere, the main event would see The Undertaker and Mankind go at it again, this time in a Buried Alive match where the loser was to be literally buried 6 feet under. Yes, wrestling, as always, is weird, and despite putting on another valiant attempt to defeat his greatest rival yet, by the end of the match, it would be the dead man who was under the dirt, seemingly being killed off in the process as Mankind further established himself as the most feared figure in the industry and the only man who had the Phenom's number. But of course, that wouldn't be the end of The Undertaker. He'd be back the following month, in fact, using his supernatural powers to once again rise from the grave as, at November 17th's Survivor Series, he'd debut a new, darker incarnation of himself, finally getting the elusive victory over his rival with this. Before that happened, though, another new Intercontinental Champion would be crowned as, finally finding himself out of the doghouse, Hunter Hearst Helmsley would pin Mark Merrow on the October 21st episode of Raw to take home the secondary strap. And while he wouldn't defend that belt at Survivor Series, he would be part of one of 4 elimination matches that night, with his team of himself, Crush, Goldust, and Jerry Lawler ultimately falling to Jake Roberts, Mark Merrow, The Stalker, and another new debuting star, Rocky Maivia. That's right, this was the first WWF match for the man who would later go on to conquer Hollywood, and taking full advantage of the moment, he'd come out the sole survivor in the end, establishing himself as someone to watch out for going forward. Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, a fake Diesel and Razor Ramon, two figures that had been brought into the company after Vince McMahon felt he could get away with recasting the roles, would be part of a team that, alongside Farouk and Vader, defeated Flash Funk, Jimmy Snuka, Savio Vega, and Yokozuna. Of course, the notoriously difficult-to-please New York crowd were having none of the budget Click members, though, and let the company know how they felt about it by raining boos down on them. That said, this would change during the semi-main event, as here, Bret Hart would finally return to WWF after almost legitimately jumping ship to WCW at one point in the summer when he was offered a big-money contract himself. Staying loyal to McMahon, though, he'd sign a 20-year contract with him instead, something which would ultimately cause the boss a major headache a year later. In kayfabe, however, the reason for his return would be nothing to do with money. No, it would come after weeks and weeks of being called out by Stone Cold Steve Austin, leading the Hitman to finally decide it was time to teach him a lesson right in the middle of the ring in Madison Square Garden. But while Austin was certainly supposed to be the heel that night, it wouldn't have known it by the reaction of the crowd, who, fully getting behind the Rattlesnake by that point, cheered him like a conquering hero, something which even Vince McMahon was forced to take note of on commentary. And while Hart would end up getting the win come the end of the bout, after the bell rang, it was clear that Austin was going to be a huge star going forward, although no one could have imagined at that time just how huge. Beyond this star-making performance, though, the other main event of the night would see Shawn Michaels defend his WWF title against Psycho Sid in a match where, despite coming in the babyface, the crowd would quickly turn on HBK, evidently having tired of his antics by that point. And this would even lead to a hugely positive reaction for Sid when he came out, as, for one brief shining moment, he looked like the superstar Vince McMahon always wanted him to be. So luckily then, the boss had already planned for this to be the night where, after some foul play at ringside involving the champ's manager Jose Lothario, Sid would be able to hit Michaels with the powerbomb and pin him in the middle of the ring to become the new WWF World Champion. Yes, it was a big moment, but it wasn't the only thing going on that weekend, as the next Hall of Fame class would also have been inducted the night prior, with this year's list of entrants including the likes of Captain Lou Albano, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Killer Kowalski, Pat Patterson, and even Vince McMahon Sr. And as it happened, this would be the last Hall of Fame for almost a decade, with the whole thing not returning again until 2004, at which point it would become a regular annual occurrence all over again. Back in '96, though, while the crowning of a new world champion had shaken things up big time heading into December, the company couldn't take their foot off the gas just yet, as they'd be heading back out for another tour of the Middle East early that month. And while there, they'd hold another tournament to decide who was going to win the Middle East Cup, with this one eventually being picked up by none other than Bret Hart. So continuing on with the momentum he'd been building ever since his return then, the Hitman would find himself in the #1 contendership spot at the final pay-per-view of the year, In Your House 12, It's Time, on December 15th. And as the name suggests, this was originally going to be a show which saw Vader in a major spot, the main event in fact, as after his WWF title win had been scrapped at SummerSlam, Vince McMahon had originally started making plans to give him the belt at Survivor Series instead. Somewhere along the way, though, plans changed with this, and, well, it's unclear exactly what happened. Based on past incidents, it can certainly be imagined Shawn Michaels had something to do with it. Regardless of the reasons, though, it would be Sid who main evented with Bret Hart, all while Vader would be left off of the card entirely. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Owen Hart and the British Bulldog would defeat the fake Razor Ramon and Diesel to retain their tag team titles, all despite an appearance from Stone Cold Steve Austin late on in the match, who, still holding a vendetta against the Hart family, continued to wage his one-man war on them, much to the increasing delight of the fan base, who now saw him more and more as the modern-day outlaw figure they could get behind. On top of that, Rocky Maivia would continue his rise with a quick victory over Salvatore Sincere. Mark Barrow would defeat Triple H to become the Intercontinental Champion once again, and The Undertaker would lay waste to Paul Bearer's newest client, The Executioner, basically territory legend Terry Gordy in a hood, in one of the most disappointing bouts of the night. That said, it was the main event people had paid to see, and that would deliver in many respects as the Hitman and the champion went to war, all while Shawn Michaels sat at the commentary booth scouting out each man as he staked his claim to a future rematch with each. Yes, at this point, the plan was to redo Bret and Shawn at WrestleMania 13 the following year. However, with real-life tensions between them continuing to grow, that would ultimately prove to be easier said than done once it was all over. Luckily then, Hart had another big rival at this time, one who would end up getting involved in this match too, acting like the reckless, uncontrollable madman people were quickly coming to fall in love with. Steve Austin would interfere towards the close of the bout, with this ultimately leading to HBK getting involved too, and accidentally costing Bret the match after the two had collided with each other on the ring apron. And after losing then, Bret would attack the former champion, taking out his frustrations on him and teasing the heel turn he would undergo in just a few months' time. That, though, is a story for another day, because this would mark the end of 1996, a year when WWF really began to transition away from the new generation era into something with far more attitude. And while things wouldn't fully blossom for a couple of years yet, the seeds that would see them enter their second boom period were already being sown here as, with the increasing beef between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, as well as the rise of Steve Austin, things were really beginning to heat up as we moved closer and closer towards the Attitude Era. The year 1997 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we were first introduced to South Park and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In music, the Spice Girls were top of the charts, and in the WWF, the year was very much split in two halves. On screen, the company was going through arguably their best year ever creatively, with some of their greatest storylines starting to develop and a number of major stars rising to the forefront. Off-screen, however, things would not be so rosy as, with WCW continuing to beat them in the ratings war, Vince McMahon's company would come closer than it ever had to going out of business. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1997, a year in review. When we last left off, Psycho Sid was the WWF champion, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels' personal war was continuing to boil, and despite being portrayed as the ultimate heel, Stone Cold Steve Austin was growing in fan popularity every week. And all these events would lead to the first pay-per-view of the year, the Royal Rumble. But before we would get there, Vince McMahon, still trying to catch the eyes of new fans to his product, would start another new show on January 4th of this year, one that featured an edgier product than normal and would air from a different New York location live every week, Shotgun Saturday Night. And while this show would never reach the heights of Raw when it came to popularity, it would be a further indicator of the new direction the company was headed in, one which would see them present themselves with a lot more attitude, something which would certainly be on display when the time for the Rumble came on January 19th, as, while on the undercard, Hunter Hearst Helmsley would retain his Intercontinental title against Goldust and Ahmed Johnson would get some revenge over his newest rival, Farouk, the world title match would see Shawn Michaels return in front of a hometown Texas crowd to finally get the better of Sid, pinning him in just under 14 minutes to start his second reign on top. Meanwhile, though, the Rumble match itself would see things end far less decisively as, after entering at number 5, Steve Austin would last all the way up until the end before he was eliminated by his chief rival Bret Hart. That said, the referees would not catch this elimination, so, in true heel fashion, Austin simply climbed back in the ring and dumped out the remaining 3 entrants, The Undertaker, Vader, and the Hitman himself, picking up the win from there in another moment that was supposed to get him over as a heel, but ended up causing fans to love him even more. But of course, with such a screwy victory, on-screen WWF President Gorilla Monsoon was never going to allow the Rattlesnake a main event spot at WrestleMania, and so would instead book him and the 3 men he illegally eliminated into a fatal 4-way match at the next pay-per-view of the year, where the winner would go on to face Shawn Michaels on the grandest stage of them all. Before that could happen though, HBK would infamously lose his smile after a knee injury caused him to vacate the title, something which many people behind the scenes, Bret Hart included, believed was being done so he wouldn't have to drop the belt to the Hitman at the big show. Yes, the plan had been for the 2 rivals to face off again in a rematch from WrestleMania 12, but with Shawn allegedly embellishing how bad his injury was, this would have to wait for the time being. Instead, the fatal four-way match at In Your House 13 Final 4 on February 16th would be for the now vacant WWF title, as in that bout, Austin, Hart, Undertaker, and Vader would all fight for the right to be named champion. And after 24 minutes and 6 seconds, it would be the Hitman who would come out the victor, making him a 4-time world champion in the process. Elsewhere, meanwhile, other notable news would see Rocky Maivia successfully defend the Intercontinental title he'd won from Hunter Hearst Helmsley on Raw just 3 days earlier, and Owen Hart and the British Bulldog managed to keep hold of their tag team titles when facing off against Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon. But really though, it was the world title picture people were really interested in, because the very next night on Raw, Psycho Sid would get his promised rematch for the belt when he took on the new champion Hart one-on-one. And in that match, after some interference from everyone's favorite outlaw Stone Cold, Sid would actually be able to win the belt, starting his second reign with the title. And of course, all this controversy would lead to the upcoming WrestleMania 13, but before we got there, another new champion would be crowned when, on the February 26th episode of Raw, the British Bulldog would defeat his partner Owen Hart in the finals of a tournament to crown the inaugural European champion. As for his brother-in-law Bret, though, well, he was having a much worse time, as with fan support for Steve Austin continuing to grow, he would start to let his frustrations out on everyone around him, at one point famously throwing down Vince McMahon and calling the whole situation bullshit on live TV. So it was clear then that in order to regain control of his legacy, the Hitman would have to not only defeat Austin, but show how much of a fraud he really was by forcing him to tap out. And this would lead to WrestleMania 13 on March 23rd where, in probably the greatest wrestling match of all time, the two would face off again, this time with the rule being that the only way to win was via submission. After a bloody war that lasted just over 22 minutes, however, Austin, unable to deal with both the pain of being locked in the sharpshooter and the extreme loss of blood he'd undergone, would pass out, forcing the special guest referee, UFC star Ken Shamrock, to call the bout for the Hitman. But in refusing to quit, Austin had endeared himself towards the Chicago crowd so much that it would cause Bret to attack him further after the bell rang, as from there, the two would switch alignments, with Austin now playing the face and Hart playing the heel. And this would end up being the highlight of a fairly weak card as it happened because, elsewhere, unable to live up to the 5-star classic that Austin and Bret had put on, things would be filled out with Rocky Maivia defending his Intercontinental title against the Sultan, and an admittedly fun Chicago street fight that saw Ahmed Johnson and the Legion of Doom defeat Farouk's Nation of Domination. Then, in the main event, The Undertaker and Sid would quite literally stink out the joint when, after allegedly soiling himself towards the end of the bout, Sid would fall to the dead man as he became the WWF champion for the second time. And this would see Paul Bearer try to weasel his way back into the new champ's good graces in the weeks that followed as, now desperate to be the manager of the top guy in the company, he attempted to blackmail Taker, telling him that if he didn't play ball, then he would reveal his most shameful secret to the world. Initially, though, The Undertaker would fight back against this, taking on and defeating Bearer's handpicked challenger Mankind at the next pay-per-view of the year, April 20th's In Your House 14, Revenge of the Taker. But that wouldn't be the only big story going into that show as, after solidifying his heel turn, but only in America, Bret Hart would reform the Hart Foundation, now made up of himself, Owen Hart, the British Bulldog, Jim Neidhart, and Brian Pillman. And this would lead to a unique situation where, still being treated like heroes in their native Canada, the Harts would force the company to shift the heel-face dynamic depending on what country they were in that week, with even Steve Austin serving as a villain going forward whenever he dared face off against the Hitman north of the border. On the night of In Your House 14, though, the Rattlesnake would remain firmly the babyface as, in the rubber match between him and Bret, he would end up picking up the disqualification win, with this making him the new #1 contender to the Phenom's world title. And that match would eventually come at In Your House 15, A Cold Day in Hell, on May 11th as it happened. Before this, though, a few things would change for Austin's chief rivals as, on the April 28th episode of Raw, Owen Hart would pick up singles gold of his own when he beat Rocky Maivia to win the Intercontinental title. So with the stable now holding the IC, European, and tag team straps, they'd do their best to get inside the Rattlesnake's head during his first big title shot. And ultimately, they'd be successful in this as, come the end of the bout, after a well-placed distraction from Bret, the Dead Man would be able to pick up the win. But of course, that wasn't the only noteworthy thing that happened that night, as prior to this, Ken Shamrock would formally make the jump over from UFC when he had his first official WWF match against Vader, a bloody and stiff battle that saw the Mastodon suffer a legitimate broken nose by the end. Yes, Shamrock was clearly keen to make an impact as quickly as possible, but as he was continuing to rise up the ranks in the weeks that followed, another big name would make their return when Shawn Michaels, now apparently having recovered from the injury which forced him to retire earlier in the year, came back to the ring to team up with the enemy of his enemy, Stone Cold Steve Austin, as together they took on Owen Hart and the British Bulldog for the tag team titles. And on the May 26th episode of Raw, they'd even be able to defeat the two heels, from there continuing an uneasy alliance which saw each hesitant to trust the other, even if both still had a bone to pick with the Hitman. But of course, while Austin and Bret's rivalry was all kayfabe, HBK's beef with the Canadian was far more real, with the two repeatedly taking shots at each other in promos around this time, and even at one point getting into a legit backstage fight. And this was supposed to climax on screen at the June 8th King of the Ring, when Hart vs. Michaels 2 was finally set to take place. That was, of course, all up until an injury picked up by the Hitman forced plans to be changed at the last minute. And those new plans, as it happened, would see the tag team champions face off against each other, with them here hoping to determine who the team captain going forward would be. Ultimately, though, the match would end in a no contest, leaving little settled between the warring partners, something which came much to the delight of the Harts. And that wouldn't be the only reason for them to be happy, as, on that same night, they'd defeat Psycho Sid and the Legion of Doom in a six-man tag, all while elsewhere, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who had by now added a bodyguard in the form of Chyna to his act, finally got to become King of the Ring. Then, in the main event of the night, The Undertaker, who had since acquiesced to Paul Bearer's demands and allowed him to manage him, would successfully defend his WWF title against Farouk. Soon after this, though, the dead man would finally reach his limit with his manager and would give him the boot, forcing Bearer to reveal his dreaded secret to the world. Kane, his long-lost brother, was still alive and had not died in the same fire that killed their parents so many years ago. What's more, Bearer claimed, it had been The Undertaker himself who started that fire, something which the dead man denied. Still though, the threat of his sibling continuing to lurk in the background would get in his head as he defended his WWF title against Vader at July 6th's In Your House 16 Canadian Stampede, with him there only barely being able to retain. But that wasn't the biggest match on this show, as, in the main event of one of the company's greatest pay-per-views ever, the Hart Foundation would come out to a rapturous home country response as they took on and defeated the alliance of Steve Austin, Ken Shamrock, Goldust, and the Legion of Doom, with Owen ultimately getting the pinfall over Austin at the end of the match. And this would cause the Rattlesnake to then spin off into a program with the youngest Hart, all while his tag team partner Shawn Michaels would be forced to vacate another belt due to injury, leading to Austin finding a new teammate in Mick Foley's latest creation, Dude Love. Yes, despite being known to WWF fans prior to this as Mankind, it would be the second face of Foley that was able to gain the respect of the Texan, as from there, they would team together as champions, holding on to these belts throughout the summer, as meanwhile, in the WWF title picture, Bret Hart would prepare to face off against The Undertaker at the upcoming SummerSlam. But what made this one even more interesting was that Shawn Michaels would act as the special guest referee, with the stipulation being that if he in any way attempted to screw the Hitman, he'd be banned from wrestling in America from there on in. So in the end, HBK played ball, counting the winning pinfall for his rival after accidentally hitting the dead man with a steel chair towards the close of the bout, something which caused him great pains both in character and in real life, as the last thing he wanted was for Bret to become champion again. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Mick Foley would morph back into Mankind to defeat Hunter Hearst Helmsley in a steel cage match, the British Bulldog would defend his European Championship against Ken Shamrock, and disaster would strike when, in the Intercontinental title match between Steve Austin and Owen Hart, a botched piledriver would lead to the Rattlesnake being temporarily paralyzed. Luckily, however, he would be able to recover enough feeling in his limbs to win both the match and the title, but after being taken to the hospital following the bout, he'd be diagnosed with a broken neck, something which would leave him unable to compete for the foreseeable future. But this would only get him more over as it happened, as now waging war against management themselves for forcing him to vacate both his Intercontinental and Tag Team titles, Austin would deliver stunners to every authority figure in his path week in and week out, with fans patiently waiting for the point where, eventually, Vince McMahon himself would be on the receiving end. Before that happened though, the next big show of the year, Ground Zero in Your House, would take place on September 7th where, while in the undercard Brian Pillman would face off against Goldust in an indecent proposal match and the Headbangers would win the vacant tag team titles, the main events would see Bret Hart successfully defend the WWF title against the Patriot. All well, after that, Shawn Michaels would be forced to reckon with the man who he'd inadvertently laid out the months prior, The Undertaker. And to help him with this, HBK had begun aligning himself with his real-life clique buddy Hunter Hearst Helmsley as, alongside Chyna and Rick Rude, they would go on to form D-Generation X, an outlaw group of heels who broke the rules at every turn, both on screen and off. So there at ringside during their stablemates bout with the Deadman then, they'd continually get involved, leading to the whole thing eventually getting deemed a no contest. But of course, there would have to be a winner eventually, so in an effort to make sure this happened, the two would meet again the following month in a brand new type of match altogether. Before we would get there though, WWF's fortunes would start to change, as after having struggled so much financially throughout 1997 that they found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, Vince McMahon would finally get a run of good luck when, after raising the price of his In Your House shows to match that of the Big 5 pay-per-views, the company would get an influx of money. Something which, combined with their slowly growing ratings, was enough to keep them on the air on the USA Network and stop the boss from having to downsize to the regional Northeast promotion that he'd already started making plans for. As well as that, it also meant that McMahon could afford to pay for Bret Hart's large contract again, something which he'd told the Hitman in the months prior he could no longer honor. As a result of this though, Bret had already started negotiations with WCW, with a deal to sign him up ultimately being finalized soon after. But now wanting to keep his champion on the books, the boss asked Hart if he could get out of this, with him only then realizing the problem he'd created for himself. Yes, the Hitman was still the WWF champion and, as part of his contract, had reasonable creative control over his final 30 days with the company, something which would cause a major issue come the time of Survivor Series. Prior to this, however, the September 22nd episode of Raw would see Steve Austin finally deliver a long-awaited stunner to Vince McMahon, teasing the legendary feud between them that was to come, and the third face of Foley, Cactus Jack, make his WWF debut to defeat Hunter Hearst Helmsley. But that wasn't all that happened that week, as just 2 days prior, the company would venture across the pond again when, at the UK-only show One Night Only, Shawn Michaels would court even more controversy when he used his backstage sway to win the European title from the British Bulldog right in front of his dying sister in the crowd. Yes, it was another example of HBK playing up to his reputation as a jackass, but come the time for October 5th's Bad Blood in Your House, he would finally get his just desserts when he faced off against The Undertaker in the first ever Hell in a Cell match, leaving him with no opportunity to escape or to get his DX friends involved. So it should come as no surprise then that this one left the European champ brutalized come the end, with him only getting the win after, to the surprise of everyone, Kane finally made his debut at the close of the bout to rip the door off the cage and lay his brother out with a tombstone piledriver. But aside from having one of the greatest matches in WWF history, Bad Blood would also be memorable for tragic reasons, as prior to the show that night, Brian Pillman was found dead in his hotel room. Aside from this, other noteworthy moments would see Owen Hart win the vacant Intercontinental title, and The Rock team with his new stable of the Nation of Domination to take on the Legion of Doom in a handicap match. Yes, after undergoing a vicious backlash from fans, Rocky Maivia had turned heel and morphed into the man who would one day go on to conquer Hollywood. But that wouldn't be the big story going into Survivor Series on November 9th, as at an event that saw Kane make his in-ring debut by destroying Mankind, and Steve Austin finally returned from injury to defeat Owen Hart for the Intercontinental title again, everyone would instead be talking about the fact that, after beating The Undertaker inside of Hell in a Cell, Shawn Michaels was finally the #1 contender to Bret Hart's WWF title, and that the match would be set for this very show. Now, the Montreal Screwjob is too big of a story to get fully into here, but in short, this would be the night that, after Bret Hart had refused to drop the belt to HBK in his home country of Canada as per the creative control clause in his contract, Vince McMahon and a select few others set out to make it appear as though he tapped out at the close of the bout, visually screwing him and making Michaels the new champion instead. After this then, Bret would trash the ringside area while all of the Hart family, minus Owen, would quit the company in disgust. Meanwhile, the next night on Raw, Vince McMahon would do a sit-down interview with Jim Ross where, sporting the black eye the Hitman had given him the night before, he'd tell the world that Bret screwed Bret, effectively giving birth to the Mr. McMahon character right there, even if, at the time, he still truly believed he was the babyface in the situation. And while who was ultimately right or wrong has been a subject of debate in the years since, fans had little time to digest it at the time, as WWF would push on forward with their final show of the year, D-Generation X in Your House, on December 7th, where the key undercard matches saw Taka Michinoku defeat Brian Christopher to become the inaugural light heavyweight champion, the New Age Outlaws successfully defend the tag team titles they'd won on a recent episode of Raw, and Jeff Jarrett get a win over The Undertaker after Kane, who was still trying to convince his brother to face him one-on-one, interfered and cost him the bout. As well as this, in the main events, Steve Austin would beat The Rock in the first teaser to a rivalry that would go on to define a generation, all while Shawn Michaels would defend the WWF title against Ken Shamrock, only to then be attacked by a returning Owen Hart at the close of the show. Yes, it seemed like the King of Hearts was back to avenge his family, but while he would get a shot at the title his brother had been screwed out of, HBK would once again use his political power to have this happen on a throwaway episode of Raw instead of the pay-per-view it deserved. As well as this, unwilling to drop the European title in an actual match, he and Triple H would make a mockery of it when, in a comedy encounter, Shawn laid down in the middle of the ring and gifted it to his stablemate on the December 22nd episode of Raw. But that wasn't the only title change that would happen in December, as Steve Austin would have vacated the Intercontinental Championship to The Rock just 2 weeks prior, with him reasoning that he had bigger fish to fry. Yes, while this represented the end of 1997, 1998 was about to see things blow up in ways it hadn't since the days of Hulk Hogan, as with Stone Cold now going after the WWF title, The Rock having morphed into his final form, The Undertaker and Kane's war getting started, and the Mr. McMahon character being born, the Attitude Era was truly about to begin. The year 1998 was a huge time in pop culture. In the world of television, we saw the final episode of Seinfeld. In sports, Michael Jordan played his last game with the Bulls, and in the wrestling world, things were about to explode as, with the second boom period starting, the industry would have arguably its most successful period ever, with Vince McMahon's company by now starting to lead the charge in this. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1998, a year in review. When we last left off, Kane had arrived and had set his sights on getting his brother The Undertaker to fight him one-on-one. Stone Cold Steve Austin was making it his mission to become WWF champion, and the then-champion Shawn Michaels had won the belt during the events of the Montreal Screwjob, an incident which also gave birth to the evil Mr. McMahon character. And of course, this event also led to the entire Hart family quitting the company, minus Owen, of course, who, after Vince refused to release him from the terms of his contract, would stay with WWF. But even if he couldn't follow his brother over to WCW, he would get some measure of revenge for him when, on the January 20th episode of Raw, he'd be able to defeat Hunter Hearst Helmsley, now going by the shortened name of Triple H, for the European Championship. And that would lead us to the first pay-per-view of the year, the Royal Rumble, where the undercard would see a newer, more bizarre incarnation of Goldust lose to Vader, and The Rock defend his Intercontinental title against Ken Shamrock. After that, the first of two main events would see Shawn Michaels defend the WWF title against The Undertaker in a casket match. But while at points, it looked like the dead man was going to win the belt here, in the end, he would be screwed out of this when Kane interfered towards the close of the bout, allowing HBK to retain as the Big Red Machine from there locked his brother inside the casket and set it ablaze, seemingly killing him in the process. Perhaps more importantly than that though, this would also be the match where Michaels would suffer a back injury after being flipped out of the ring onto the casket, something which would turn out to be so serious he wouldn't step in the ring again until WrestleMania. Elsewhere though, the other main event would be the Rumble match itself where, while Mick Foley was entering all three of his characters into the bout and The Rock was putting on a very impressive showing, it would ultimately be all about Steve Austin as, after entering at number 24, he'd eliminate everyone in his path, from there going on to win the whole thing and book himself a spot in the main event at WrestleMania. One person who wasn't happy about this, however, was Vince McMahon, as now starting to see the Rattlesnake as too much of a loose cannon, especially after he'd given him a stunner the year prior, made it clear around this time that he felt Austin as the top guy in his promotion wasn't an eventuality he wanted to see. And this feeling certainly wasn't helped when, the next night on Raw, while Mike Tyson was making a special appearance, Stone Cold would come out to the ring to trash talk the baddest man on the planet, from there flipping him off and getting into a brawl in one of Raw's most memorable segments ever. So, furious over this, McMahon would desperately try to separate the two, all while berating the Rattlesnake for ruining his big announcement that Iron Mike was going to be a special guest enforcer at that year's WrestleMania's main event. And this would draw a lot of mainstream attention to the company in the weeks that followed, something the company hoped to capitalize on with their next big show of the year, No Way Out of Texas, in your house on February 15th, where, while Kane was continuing his path of destruction by defeating Vader, and Mark Merrow grew more and more jealous of his wife Sable's success, in the final match of the show, Steve Austin would team with Cactus Jack, Chainsaw Charlie, and Owen Hart to take on and defeat Triple H, the New Age Outlaws, and Savio Vega. Yes, with his back injury being too severe, HBK wouldn't be able to step into the ring on this night, and this would unfortunately send him further into a spiral of drug use and depression. That said, his DX teammate would have a better time during this period, as on the March 16th episode of Raw, he'd be able to defeat Owen Hart to regain the European Championship. And this would lead to them having one final battle at WrestleMania 14 later that month. All well, around this, the rest of the undercard would see The Rock successfully defend his Intercontinental title against Ken Shamrock, Sable finally send Mark Merrow packing after they were able to defeat Goldust and Luna in a mixed tag, and a brutal dumpster match for the tag team titles where the New Age Outlaws faced off against Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie. Of course, anyone watching at the time will remember that this one came about after the Outlaws had trapped the rivals inside of a dumpster and thrown them off the stage a few weeks prior to this in one of the wildest stunts the company had done at the time. On the night of Mania, however, the babyfaces would be able to get the revenge for this assault when they beat Road Dogg and Billy Gunn, becoming the new tag team champions in the process. Then after that, in the semi-main event, The Undertaker, who had returned to TV in the weeks leading up to the show, finally faced off against Kane, with him eventually being able to beat him here so as to take his undefeated streak to 7-0. So once that was over, the only thing left was the main event, where Shawn Michaels was able to gut it out enough to step in the ring one more time as he faced off against Stone Cold Steve Austin. And while HBK would struggle to move at points during this given the severity of his back injury, the Rattlesnake looked like a star throughout, eventually hitting the champ with a stunner and pinning him after just over 20 minutes. From there, getting his hand raised by Mike Tyson as Jim Ross proclaimed on commentary that the Austin era had begun. And begun it most certainly had, because the next night on Raw, while Triple H was rebuilding DX into a babyface stable following the retirement of Shawn Michaels, the Austin McMahon story would get started with a bang when, after refusing to act as Vince's corporate puppet going forward, Stone Cold would deliver another stunner to the boss, with this one setting things in motion for the two to feud for the rest of the year. So intense would things get, in fact, that 2 weeks later, it even looked like they were going to face off in the ring, with the intrigue this created allowing Raw to beat Nitro in the ratings for the first time in 83 weeks. And that would start a trend that saw WWF make it a two-horse race once more as, with wrestling exploding in popularity all around the world, everyone would be glued to their screens on Monday nights, flicking between both shows, all while the likes of DX were further stoking the flames by famously invading a WCW show on a Jeep. And in terms of the Austin McMahon rivalry at this point, the boss's next big move would be to pick a series of hand-picked challengers to get the belt off of the Rattlesnake, with the first of these being Dude Love, a character Mick Foley had once again morphed into after losing the tag team titles back to the New Age Outlaws on the Raw after WrestleMania. And their first showdown would come at April 26th Unforgiven in your house, where despite taking the champion to his limit, the Dudester would be unable to win the belt, much to the chagrin of Mr. McMahon. Elsewhere on that show, meanwhile, The Rock, who had recently kicked Farouk out of the Nation and taken up the position of the group's leader instead, would continue his rise when he teamed with D'Lo Brown and Mark Henry to take on the aforementioned Farouk, Ken Shamrock, and Steve Blackman. As well as this, The Undertaker and Kane would face off once again, this time in an Inferno match where, by the end of things, it would be the Big Red Machine who would be set ablaze. So in the weeks following this on Raw then, Kane would temporarily move his attention towards Vader, all while The Undertaker would seek to ensure Stone Cold had a fair shot at keeping his WWE title. And this would ultimately see him act as a ringside enforcer the next month at Over the Edge in Your House, balancing things out there after Vince McMahon had decided to make himself the special guest referee in the rematch between Steve Austin and Dude Love. But even with him acting as the ref, it would be Austin who managed to come out of the night the champion, causing the boss to go to Plan B in the weeks that followed. And this Plan B, as it turned out, would be Kane, as after winning a #1 contendership match in the weeks following, he'd become the next challenger in line to face the Rattlesnake at the King of the Ring in a First Blood match. Of course, when that event was over, it wouldn't be the world title match people were talking about, even if it did end up seeing Kane win. No, instead, they'd be talking about the Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind, as there, Mick Foley would take his most insane bump yet when he was thrown off the top of the cage, falling 16 feet below through the Spanish announce table. After that, he'd somehow get back up, only to then be chokeslammed through the cage, from there starting the match that would go down as maybe the most violent in wrestling history. Elsewhere, meanwhile, a new King of the Ring would be crowned when, after defeating The Rock in the final, Ken Shamrock would take home the crown that had previously been held by the likes of Bret Hart and Stone Cold. That said, it would be Stone Cold and not Ken Shamrock who was the focus of the Raw following King of the Ring, as after having lost his title when an errant chair shot from The Undertaker led many to start speculating the two brothers were now on the same side, he demanded his rematch with the Big Red Machine, eventually getting this and being able to pin him later that night so as to regain his lost gold. And that wouldn't be the only title change happening around this time, as, that same month, D'Lo Brown would continue the ongoing rivalry between The Nation and D-Generation X when he was able to defeat Triple H for the European title. As well as this, Kane and Mankind, now both having common enemies in The Undertaker, would form a team and quickly earn themselves a shot at the tag team champions, the New Age Outlaws, from there defeating them to take home the belts for themselves. And their first big defense of these belts would come at July 26th fully loaded, as there, they would be forced to face off against the team of Steve Austin and The Undertaker, a team who would ultimately be able to coexist enough to defeat them and start their own reign on top. But what made this even more interesting was that, by then, the Dead Man had already been announced as the next contender to the Rattlesnake's title, something which led to them now having to spend the weeks that followed partnering up, all while also preparing to face off against each other at SummerSlam. And ultimately, these dual purposes would get the better of them, as on the August 10th episode of Raw, Kane and Mankind would regain their belts, all as elsewhere on the show, Jim Cornette's NWA invasion was petering out into nothingness, and the infamous Brawl for All was seeing more people get injured than get over. Yes, not everything in 1998 was a home run. After all, let's not forget this was the year of the infamous Val Venus choppy your pee-pee angle. That said, when it came to the big shows, Vince McMahon was firing on all cylinders as, with mainstream attention continuing to get bigger every week and WWF continuing to get the better of WCW in the ratings war, they'd be red hot by the time SummerSlam rolled around on August 30th. So, giving the Madison Square Garden crowd a show worthy of the hype then, the undercard would see Sable continue her rise when she teamed with newcomer Edge to defeat Mark Marrow and Jacqueline. Ken Shamrock defeat Owen Hart in a Lion's Den match, and the Nation and DX finally blow off their feud when the group's respective leaders, The Rock and Triple H, faced off in an excellent ladder match for the Intercontinental title. But despite the game being the one to get the win here, by the end of the bout, it was clear that The Rock would be the company's next big star as, despite being the heel that night, the raucous New York crowd would cheer for him throughout, mirroring what had happened with Steve Austin 2 years prior. As for the Rattlesnake's experience in the Garden on this night though, well, that would be far more stressful, as after Kane had abandoned his partner Mankind to lose their tag team titles to the New Age Outlaws in a handicap match, speculation only intensified that he would come out to help his brother later in the night. In the end though, this would not happen at all, as still acting as the babyface, The Undertaker would demand his brother stay backstage as he finally went one-on-one with Austin for the biggest prize in the company. And perhaps it was this reluctance to accept help that cost him in the end, as after just over 20 minutes, Stone Cold would retain, continuing his reign and causing Vince McMahon even more headaches as a result. Still, the boss had one more ace up his sleeve as, in the lead-up to the next month's pay-per-view, Breakdown in Your House, he would be able to confirm that the Brothers of Destruction were indeed working together, from there placing them both in what was effectively a handicap match with Austin at that show, and leaving the champion with little opportunity to retain. Meanwhile, with fan response growing too large to ignore, The Rock and Mankind would turn babyface around this time too, with this ultimately seeing them getting placed into a triple threat steel cage #1 contendership match at Breakdown, a match that also included Ken Shamrock. Come the end of that one though, it would be the People's Champion who would pick up the win as, by now, his popularity was actually threatening to eclipse that of Steve Austin's. Any hopes that we would see Austin versus The Rock in the immediate future were dashed though when, in the main event of the show, both The Undertaker and Kane would simultaneously pin the Rattlesnake, leaving the identity of the new champion up in the air. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the Hardy Boys would make their first big splash on pay-per-view when they defeated Kaientai, all while a name closely associated with them, Edge, would continue his own rise as he faced off against Owen Hart. That wasn't what was on most fans' minds at the time, however, as, after the indecisive nature of the world title match, they'd tune into Raw in droves the next night to see who the new champion was going to be. Before Vince McMahon could make a decision on this though, the Rattlesnake would get a measure of revenge when he drove down to the ringside area on a Zamboni and delivered a well-deserved beatdown to the Boss. After that, as he was being escorted from the building by local police, McMahon would announce that the title was going to be held up as vacant, something which infuriated the Brothers of Destruction so much that they would kayfabe break Vince's ankle, from there leaving him in a wheelchair for the next couple of months. But that wouldn't be the only title up in the air at this point as, after suffering an injury, Triple H would be forced to vacate the Intercontinental Championship, leaving it temporarily held up as vacant too, all before it was later won by Ken Shamrock in a tournament. And as well as this, the WWF Women's title would also be reactivated around this time, with Jacqueline eventually serving as its first holder during this era. That said, she wouldn't get to defend her newly won belt on the next pay-per-view of the year, October 18th's Judgment Day in Your House. No, she'd have to settle for accompanying Mark Marrow to the ring instead, as he was suffering a loss to Al Snow. Elsewhere, meanwhile, newcomer Christian would get his first big moment in WWF when he pinned Taka Michinoku to win the light heavyweight title, all well after that, X-Pac would defeat D'Lo Brown for the European title. But of course, it was the main event everyone was interested in, one that featured The Undertaker and Kane fighting it out over the vacant WWF title. And the added wrinkle to this one was that Steve Austin had been appointed the special guest referee by Vince McMahon himself, with the boss promising that if the Rattlesnake refused to count the pin at the end of the match, he'd be gone from the company for good. Ever the rebel though, Austin would have none of this, instead ending the bout by laying out both of the Brothers of Destruction and announcing himself as the winner, something which left McMahon with no choice but to tell him he was fired. So the next night on Raw, the former WWF champion would get his revenge when he invaded the show and began terrorizing the boss, at one point forcing him to urinate himself on live TV. Then once he was done with that, he'd announce he'd been rehired by Vince's own son Shane, with him also being granted a WWF title shot as a result of this new contract. So needing to find a new hand-picked lackey quickly then, the boss would once again start taking Mick Foley under his wing, grooming him to be his new corporate toy from there as he bestowed upon him a new title, the Hardcore Championship. And this would all lead into the next pay-per-view of the year on November 15th, Survivor Series, where, in maybe Vince Russo's finest hour, the whole show would tell a single, isolated story that took the form of a one-night tournament to crown a new WWF champion. And of course, much to the chagrin of the boss, Austin's guaranteed title shot would earn him a spot in this tournament, as would The Rock's #1 contendership role. This all despite the fact the People's Champion had also become an enemy of Vince in the weeks leading up to the show. As well as that, since they had beaten Austin for the title already, The Undertaker and Kane would both get buys, skipping a first round that saw Al Snow defeat Jeff Jarrett, Ken Shamrock defeat Goldust, McMahon's surrogate son Mankind defeat Dwayne Gill, The Rock and Steve Austin both defeat the Big Boss Man, who got 2 shots on account of his position with the corporation, and Steve Regal and X-Pac go to a double countout. Of course, this last result meant that both men would be eliminated, and as a result of these brackets, Austin would get a bye into the next round, leaving the boss furious as he instead focused on trying to make sure that at least The Rock didn't advance to the semis. Despite his best efforts though, the People's Champion would be able to defeat Ken Shamrock in the quarterfinals, all while Mankind was also getting the better of Al Snow, and a newly heel Undertaker would take out his brother Kane. Before the next round, though, there'd be a break, as in women's action, Sable and Jacqueline would go at it, with the face able to get the win here so as to become the new women's champion. After that, the semifinals of the tournament would see The Rock beat The Undertaker, and Mankind beat Steve Austin when Shane McMahon screwed the Rattlesnake by revealing himself to have been allied with his father all along. That wasn't the biggest shock of the night, though, as in the final, the People's Champion would do the unthinkable when he turned heel, siding with the McMahons, then taking out Mankind to become, at the time, the youngest WWF champion. From there, abandoning the people and proclaiming himself to be the corporate champion. Of course, this would leave Mankind to realize that he'd been played, and so, from there, he would make it his aim to take the belt away from Rocky going forward, with this leading into the final US pay-per-view of the year on December 13th, Rock Bottom in Your House. And we say final US pay-per-view because a few weeks prior to that, WWF would venture back across the pond for the UK-only show Capital Carnage, a show that actually saw Jim Ross suffer a relapse of Bell's palsy, forcing him to be removed from TV for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, back in America, Gillberg would defeat Christian to become light heavyweight champion, and the corporation would further consolidate their power when the Big Boss Man became hardcore champion. Ultimately, though, it was all about keeping the title on The Rock, as at the aforementioned Rock Bottom, he would be able to retain against Mankind when a screwy finish saw him pass out while in the Mandible Claw, with Vince McMahon then deciding that as he technically did not tap, he wouldn't lose the belt. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Edge and Christian would continue to make a name for themselves as part of the Brood when they defeated the Job Squad. All while in the main event, Steve Austin would earn a spot in the 1999 Royal Rumble when he beat The Undertaker in a Buried Alive match. Of course, the Dead Man would return soon enough to start his own Ministry of Darkness, but that would be a story for another day because after a couple more title changes on Raw in the weeks that followed, which saw Road Dogg become Hardcore Champion and Ken Shamrock and the Big Boss Man become Tag Team Champions, 1998 would draw to a close. And what a year it had been, as over the 12-month period, WWF had been able to revive itself from the point of death, becoming a pop culture behemoth once again as the Attitude Era exploded into the mainstream. What they didn't realize yet, though, was that over the next couple of years, things would get even bigger. The year 1999 was a huge year in pop culture. In television, we were introduced to The Sopranos. In film, American Pie would first hit theaters. And in the WWF, the Attitude Era would continue to roll on, with Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock both in their primes at the same time in the same company. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1999, a year in review. When we last left off, The Undertaker was continuing to build his demonic Ministry of Darkness. The Rock had turned heel and become WWF champion, and both Steve Austin and Mankind had laid claims to being the one to unseat him. And this would lead to the January 4th episode of Raw where, while over on Nitro, WCW was continuing to seal its eventual fate with the infamous finger poke of doom and a poorly thought out butts in seats line, Mick Foley would have one of the most feel-good moments in wrestling history when, with a little help from the Texas Rattlesnake, he'd win the WWF title to probably the loudest pop ever heard from a wrestling crowd to this day. So, demanding his rematch then, The Rock would head into the first pay-per-view of the year, the Royal Rumble, on January 24th as the challenger. What would make this return bout so interesting, though, was that, only willing to give the Great One another shot under the condition that it be an I Quit match, the corporation would now have to think up a way to do the seemingly impossible, and that was make Mick Foley give up. And their way of doing this then would see The Rock deliver 11 brutal, unprotected chair shots to the head of the champion in a moment that, even for the bloodthirsty 90s audience, was considered too far by many at the time. After that, a recording played over the arena's loudspeakers would make it appear as though Mankind had quit, giving the Great One the screwy victory under the most violent of circumstances. But while this seemingly booked him a spot in the main event of WrestleMania, his challenger was still to be decided as, in the Royal Rumble match itself, 30 men would battle it out for that honor. And as it happened, the first two entrants here would be none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin and Vince McMahon, with this marking the first time that the Rattlesnake had officially gotten his hands on the boss in a match. In the end though, after some further screwy antics that saw Austin temporarily be taken out of the arena on a wheelchair, then returned to finish the Rumble, it would be McMahon himself who came out the winner when he dumped his heated rival over the top rope to reign victorious. Of course, not wanting to face The Rock at WrestleMania, however, Vince would relinquish his title shot the next night on Raw, only for on-screen commissioner Shawn Michaels to announce that, as Austin had been the runner-up of the Royal Rumble, this meant he was now the #1 contender. And so knowing he held all the cards from there, the Rattlesnake would give the boss one more opportunity to win this title shot back off of him, on the condition that it be in a one-on-one steel cage match between the two. But that wasn't the end of the corporation's problems, because due to the controversial nature of the WWF title match the night prior, it was announced that, at the Halftime Heat show on January 26th, Mankind would get another chance to win the belt, this time in an empty arena match. And when that one was over, it would be Mrs. Foley's baby boy who came out the winner as, from there, he started his second reign on top. So heading into St. Valentine's Day Massacre in your house on February 14th, it felt like everything was in play, as while The Rock and Mankind would square off again for the title in a last man standing match, Austin and McMahon would finally go one-on-one for the #1 contendership spot. Meanwhile, the undercard would see Bob Holly defeat Al Snow to win the Hardcore title, Jeff Jarrett and Owen Hart defend their newly won tag team titles against D'Lo Brown and Mark Henry, Val Venus win the Intercontinental title from Ken Shamrock, and Chyna, who had just turned heel and joined the corporation, team up with Kane to take on her former DX stablemates Triple H and X-Pac. Then, in the two main events, things would end in controversy once again when, during the WWF title match, both men simultaneously knocked each other out, leaving neither able to answer the 10 count. After this, in the steel cage match, a debuting Big Show would come up from under the ring to lay out Steve Austin, only to then throw him so hard into the cage that he inadvertently broke it and allowed the fan favorite to drop down to victory and right into the main event of WrestleMania. Before we would get there, though, The Undertaker and his ministry would set their sights on enacting a hostile takeover of the company when they began going after the boss and his family. Elsewhere, meanwhile, while Shane McMahon would win the European title, Road Dogg would win the Intercontinental title, and Billy Gunn would win the Hardcore title on episodes of Raw. The Rock would finally settle his beef with Mankind when, on February 15th, he would defeat him in a ladder match to regain the WWF title once and for all. Yes, 1999 was the year that the company went full Vince Russo with title changes, so they would be coming thick and fast now, far too fast for us to take note of them all in this video. What we'll focus on instead is the next big show of the year, WrestleMania 15 on March 28th, where after an undercard that saw Butterbean eviscerate Brawl for All winner Bart Gunn in a boxing match, Triple H turned heel on DX after he helped Shane McMahon defeat X-Pac, and The Undertaker continue his war on the McMahons by making short work of the Big Boss Man inside Hell in a Cell. The main event would be about Austin versus The Rock. That's right, it was the match that everyone had been waiting for, and when the time for the bell rang, it didn't disappoint. Come the end though, despite the best attempts of the corporation, it would be the Rattlesnake who came out on top after special guest referee Mick Foley had helped even the odds. So now fighting from underneath, the heel faction would goad the Rattlesnake into giving the Great One a rematch on the following month's Backlash, this being after the challenger had stolen the champ's signature Smoking Skull belt and thrown it into the river, mimicking the very same thing Austin had done to him 2 years prior. But that wouldn't be the only big match at this show, as, elsewhere, Mankind would defeat the Big Show in a Boiler Room brawl, Triple H would cement his heel turn with a win over X-Pac, and The Undertaker, who had now set his sights on Vince's daughter Stephanie, would pick up a win over corporation member Ken Shamrock. Once that was done though, Austin and The Rock would go at it again, with this one arguably being better than the first, as for just over 17 minutes, they would wage war. Come the end though, it would be Austin who came out on top, something which led to The Rock finally doing what every fan wanted to see him do the next night on Raw, and that was abandon the corporation and turn face. As for the Rattlesnake, however, well, after saving Stephanie McMahon from being part of The Undertaker's Black Wedding later that same night, he'd find the dead man rising to the position of #1 contender. Before their match would come though, WWF would debut a new weekly show, SmackDown on UPN. But while this would give fans who were desperate for more content an extra 2 hours a week, it would ultimately mark the beginning of the end for the show's head writer Vince Russo, as with the increased workload this gave him, he was starting to feel the burn. But that was far from the biggest news story in wrestling come the end of the month as, after having gone over to the UK to put on an exclusive pay-per-view event, No Mercy, the WWF roster would return just in time for May 23rd's Over the Edge. And while this show would see The Undertaker win the WWF title from Steve Austin after a Shane McMahon heel turn, and The Rock continue his babyface rise by defeating Triple H, the only thing people remember about this show today is that it's the one where Owen Hart died after a stunt which was supposed to see him rappel down from the ceiling went wrong, causing him to fall more than 70 feet to the ring below. So despite going on with the show in the moment, something which drew a lot of criticism at the time, WWF would dedicate the following night's episode of Raw to the memory of Owen, removing any storyline progression from the show, and instead just having his fellow performers wrestle in tribute to him. Then, once everyone in the company had an opportunity to grieve for him just a little, it would be back to full steam ahead the following week, as after months of teasing, the higher power, the person secretly behind The Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness, was revealed to be Vince McMahon all along. Yes, it didn't make any sense then, and it doesn't make any sense now, but while it was unintentionally hilarious to hear Jim Ross shout "son of a bitch" after the boss pulled up his hood, most people forget that this was the same segment where, minutes later, Linda and Stephanie McMahon came down to inform the McMahon men that, as revenge for the torture they'd put Stephanie through in pursuit of screwing with Steve Austin, they had relinquished their control of the company over to the Rattlesnake himself, making him the majority owner of WWF. And this would lead to some great comedy segments in the weeks that followed, which saw Austin take over the company's headquarters, hosting drinking competitions, restructuring management in his own image, and dumping cow manure in McMahon's office in the process. So knowing they would have to do something drastic to get control of WWF back, Vince and Shane would challenge the Rattlesnake to a winner-take-all handicap ladder match at June 27th's King of the Ring. And it was there that, after some unknown figure raised the briefcase holding full control of the company, stopping Austin from being able to reach it, the McMahons would finally be able to wrangle power back. Of course, that wasn't all that was going on during this show, as elsewhere, Billy Gunn would become the new King of the Ring, and The Undertaker would successfully defend the WWF title against The Rock. But that title run was about to come to an end sooner rather than later anyway, because in his last act before losing control of the company, Stone Cold had booked himself a shot at the Deadman the following night on Raw. And during that match, one which drew the biggest rating the show had ever seen at this point, Austin would come out the victor again, starting his fourth reign on top. So with Vince deciding that enough was finally enough and that this beef between him and the champion had to end, he would announce a first blood match for the next pay-per-view of the year, July 25th's Fully Loaded. And as well as having Austin defend the WWF title against the boss's hand-picked surrogate, The Undertaker, in this one, an added stipulation would state that if Stone Cold lost, he'd never be able to challenge for the WWF title again. Alternatively though, if the Deadman lost, Vince McMahon would disappear from TV forever. Spoiler, The Undertaker lost and Vince McMahon was WWF champion by the end of the summer. That said, aside from the craziness of the main event scene, Fully Loaded would be notable for it seeing Triple H finally rise to the next level when he beat The Rock to become the #1 contender to the world title. And that would seemingly set up the main event of August 22nd's SummerSlam, as with Austin the champion and Triple H the challenger, it looked like things would be settled one-on-one. Before we would get there though, multiple spanners would be thrown in the works when, at one point, Chyna became the #1 contender, with initial plans at this point even being for her to beat Austin for the belt. In the end though, that wouldn't happen, and by the time the match came, it would have turned into a triple threat match which included the Rattlesnake, The Game, and Mankind. And to the shock of everyone who expected this night to be Triple H's coronation, it would actually be Foley who came out of the show as a champion, with the winning pinfall being counted by then Governor of Minnesota and former WWF star Jesse the Body Ventura. Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, The Rock would put a swift end to Billy Gunn's main event run when he beat him in a Kiss My Ass match. The Undertaker and The Big Show would become the tag team champions after defeating the unlikely alliance of Kane and X-Pac, and Test, who had by then started an on-screen relationship with Stephanie McMahon, would fight it out with Shane McMahon over the right to continue seeing her. And upon beating the McMahon son that night then, Test and Stephanie's love affair would continue to blossom as, soon, they would begin to make plans for an on-screen wedding. In a far less romantic scene, however, Triple H would demolish Mankind on the Raw after SummerSlam to finally reach the top of the mountain himself. But that wasn't to say nothing else worthwhile would be coming Mick Foley's way then, as, around this time, he'd form an unlikely alliance of his own with The Rock, as from there, the Odd Couple pair briefly became tag team champions. Meanwhile, Chyna, in lieu of being able to become WWF champion, had begun going after then Intercontinental champion Jeff Jarrett. All well, parallel to this, Al Snow and the Big Boss Man were starting an infamous feud of their own over the Hardcore title, which saw the heel cop cook and serve Snow's own dog Pepper to him. Yes, not everything about the Attitude Era was good, but one thing that certainly was happened just a few weeks prior to this, as on the August 8th episode of Raw, Chris Jericho had made his debut with the company, jumping ship from WCW in one of the most memorable segments in the Red Brand's history. And despite having a rocky start on the new roster, by the time it got to September 26th Unforgiven, he'd be finding his footing, as there, he would go one-on-one with X-Pac. As for the rest of the show, well, that would see Jeff Jarrett win round 1 of his feud with Chyna. The Acolytes give a stiff welcome to newcomers from ECW, the Dudley Boys, and Al Snow and the Big Boss Man have arguably the worst match in WWF history when they faced off inside the Kennel from Hell. On top of that, the increasingly convoluted main event scene would see a vacant WWF title be defended in a six-pack challenge, which featured Triple H, The Big Show, the British Bulldog, Kane, Mankind, and The Rock. And the reason this title had been vacated was that on the September 16th episode of SmackDown, Vince McMahon had returned to TV with the blessing of Steve Austin under the condition that he give him a rematch for the belt he lost at SummerSlam at a later date. What ended up being the bigger story coming out of that night, however, was that after having trash-talked the boss and insulted his family, Triple H would end up losing the title to Vince later that night, albeit with a little help from Stone Cold. So realizing he couldn't defend the strap going forward, McMahon would vacate it the following week, with this leading to the aforementioned six-pack challenge where, after just over 20 minutes, the game was finally able to recover his lost gold, this despite the fact that the odds had been stacked against him so heavily by the boss. And now, finally, definitively on top of the mountain in WWF, the new champion would take his belt over to the final UK show of the year, Rebellion, a week later, where he would defend against The Rock in a steel cage match. That said, by the time the company had returned to the US for the next big pay-per-view of the year, No Mercy, on October 17th, Vince Russo would have quit the company, taking himself and his writing partner Ed Ferrara over to WCW from there, as now, without the man who had allegedly been responsible for so much of the Attitude Era's success thus far, WWF were left scrambling to figure out what to do next. As it happened though, they needn't have worried because No Mercy would see the rise of tag team wrestling within the company once again when, in a tag team ladder match, Edge and Christian would take on the Hardy Boys, with the bout they put on here turning all four men into instant stars and beginning a revolution in the division. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the rest of the undercard would see 60-year-old Fabulous Moolah become women's champion after defeating Ivory, Chyna break new ground by becoming the first ever female Intercontinental champion after finally pinning Jeff Jarrett, and The Rock and his feud with the British Bulldog, a feud which probably climaxed a couple of weeks earlier on SmackDown when he, as Michael Cole so memorably put it, rock-bottomed him onto the dog poop. The dog poop! The dog poop! And after all that was done, the main event would see Steve Austin finally get his shot at Triple H for the WWF title. Unfortunately though, by this point, the Rattlesnake's neck issues following his near paralysis 2 years prior had gotten so bad that he was going to have to get surgery, something which would take him out of action for the next year. So with this being his final match for the foreseeable future then, he would do the honors for the game on this night, putting him over strong come the end. Not that fans would realize this was his exit yet though, as the company would continue to promote the main event of their next pay-per-view, November 14th Survivor Series, as being a triple threat encounter between Austin, Triple H, and The Rock right up until the night of the show. In fact, it wasn't until a backstage segment showed Austin being run over by an unseen driver that fans realized he wasn't going to be performing that night. No, instead, they would get a replacement in the form of the Big Show, someone who, despite being a legitimate giant, hadn't exactly been booked strongly since he joined WWF earlier that year. And that was why it was so surprising then when, come the end of that match, he'd have beaten both of his opponents to start his first reign as world champion, something which led Triple H to feel even more disrespected as he'd had no time to prepare for a new challenger. But that wasn't the only big moment of the show, as, prior to this, Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle would make his debut with the company by scoring a win over Shawn Stasiak. Kane would get his revenge on X-Pac, with this being after their friendship had turned sour when the former DX member screwed the Big Red Machine and stole his girlfriend. And Chyna would retain her Intercontinental title against Chris Jericho. So with all this going on, you'd think things couldn't get any crazier, but you'd be wrong, because just 2 weeks later, at the long-awaited wedding of Stephanie McMahon and Test on the November 29th episode of Raw, Triple H would take his grudge with Vince McMahon to the next level when he interrupted the proceedings to announce that prior to the show that week, he had gotten the billion-dollar princess drunk in Vegas and married her himself. And obviously infuriated over this then, Vince would challenge the game to a no-holds-barred match at the final pay-per-view of the year, December 12th's Armageddon, with the added stipulation here being that, if the boss won, then Triple H would have to annul the marriage. Before we would get there, though, the rest of the card that night would see Chris Jericho defeat Chyna to become Intercontinental Champion, the Rock and Sock Connection continue their run of success together by regaining their tag titles from the New Age Outlaws, and the Big Boss Man get a world title feud when he'd fall to the Giant in a one-on-one match. Then in the main event, Triple H and Vince McMahon would go to war for almost half an hour, with this one eventually ending in another shocker when Stephanie turned on her father, revealing that she'd been aligned with the game all along, and that as revenge for Vince trying to sacrifice her to The Undertaker earlier in the year, from there on in, she'd be taking over the show. Yes, for the next few months at least, it would be the newly formed McMahon-Helmsley regime that ran things, something which came much to the chagrin of the babyface roster. But that's ultimately a story for another day, because this would mark the end of 1999, a year where so much happened that it was hard to keep track of at times. Yes, even in a 20-minute video, we've barely been able to mention the multitude of title changes that happened. And on top of that, we never even got a chance to get into the exits of Jeff Jarrett, Sable, and Ken Shamrock, or such memorable moments such as GTV, the Rock and Sock Connections This Is Your Life segment, and the ridiculous scene of the Big Boss Man invading the Big Show's father's funeral and driving away with the casket. Hell, we haven't even mentioned that, on the final SmackDown of the year, the Intercontinental title lineage was thrown up in the air when, during their rubber match, Chris Jericho and Chyna would pin each other, leading to them being named co-champions. So now, with a more focused show, and the company still riding a wave of mainstream attention, they would enter into what many to this day still believe to be their best year ever. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.